Let's open our imaginations and begin. Part 1. It is but the giving over of a game that must be lost. Come, Mrs. Arne. Come, my dear, you must not give way like this. You can't stand it, you really can't. Let Miss Kate take you away, now do, urged the nurse with her most motherly of intonations. Yes, Alice, Mrs. Joyce is right. Come away, do come away. You are only making yourself ill. It is all over, you can do nothing. Oh, do come away, implored Mrs. Arne's sister, shivering with excitement and nervousness. A few moments ago, Dr. Graham had relinquished his hold on the pulse of Edward Arne with the helpless movement of the eyebrows that meant the end. The nurse had made a little gesture of resignation that was possibly a matter of form with her. The young sister-in-law had hidden her face in her hands. The wife had screamed a scream that had turned them all hot and cold and flung herself on the bed over her dead husband. There she lay. Her cries were terrible. Her sobs shook her whole body. The three gazed at her pityingly, not knowing what to do next. The nurse, folding her hands, looked toward the doctor for directions, and the doctor drummed with his fingers on the bedpost. The young girl timidly stroked the shoulder that heaved and writhed under her touch. Go away! Go away! Her sister reiterated continually, in a voice hoarse with fatigue and passion. Leave her alone, Miss Kate, whispered the nurse at last. She will work it off best herself, perhaps. She turned down the lamp, as if to draw a veil over the scene. Mrs. Arne raised herself on her elbow, showing a face stained with tears and purple with emotions. What, not gone? She asked harshly. Go away, Kate, go away. It is my house. I don't want you. I want no one. I want to speak to my husband. Will you go away, all of you? Give me an hour, half an hour, 5 minutes. She stretched out her arms imploringly to the doctor. Well, said he, almost to himself. He signed to the two women to withdraw and followed them out into the passage. Go and get something to eat, he said peremptorily, while you can. We shall have trouble with her presently. I'll wait in the dressing room. He glanced at the twisting figure on the bed, shrugged his shoulders, and passed into the adjoining room without, however, closing the door of communication. Sitting down in an armchair drawn up to the fire, he stretched himself and closed his eyes. The professional aspects of the case of Edward Arne rose up before him in all its interesting forms of complication. It was just this professional attitude that Mrs. Arne unconsciously resented both in the doctor and in the nurse. Through all their kindness, she had realized and resented their scientific interest in her husband, for to them he had been no more than a curious and complicated case, and now that the blow had fallen, she regarded them both in the light of executioners. Her one desire, expressed with all the shameless sincerity of blind and thoughtless misery, was to be free of their hateful presence and alone with her dead. She was weary of the doctor's subdued manly tones, of the nurse's commonplace motherliness, too habitually adapted to the needs of all to be appreciated by the individual, of the childish consolation of the young sister who had never loved, never been married, did not know what sorrow was. Their expressions of sympathy struck her like blows. The touch of their hands on her body as they tried to raise her stung her in every nerve. With a sigh of relief, she buried her head in the pillow, pressed her body more closely against that of her husband, and lay motionless. The lamp went out with a gurgle. The fire leapt up and died. She raised her head and stared about her helplessly. Then, sinking down again, she put her lips to the ear of the dead man. Edward, dear Edward, she whispered, why have you left me? Darling, why have you left me? I can't stay behind. You know I can't. I'm too young to be left. It's only a year since you married me. I never thought it was only for a year. Till death do us part. Yes, I know that's in it, but nobody ever thinks of that. I never thought of living without you. I meant to die with you. No, I can't die. I must not, till my baby is born. You will never see it. Don't you want to see it? Don't you? Oh, Edward, speak, say something, darling, one word, one little word. Edward, Edward, are you there? Answer me, for God's sake, answer me. Darling, I am so tired of waiting. Oh, think, dearest, there is so little time. They only gave me half an hour. In half an hour they will come and take you away from me, take you to where I can't come to you. With all my love, I can't come to you. I know the place. I saw it once, a great lonely place full of graves and little stunted trees dripping with dirty London rain, and gas lamps flaring all around, but quite dark where the grave is. A long grey stone, just like all the rest. How could you stay there, all alone without me? Do you remember, Edward, what we once said, that whichever of us died first should come back to watch over the other in the spirit? I promised you, and you promised me. What children we were! Death is not what we thought. It comforted us to say that then. Now it's nothing, worse than nothing. I don't want your spirit. I can't see it or feel it. I want you, your eyes that looked at me, your mouth that kissed me. She raised his arms and clasped them round her neck and lay there very still, murmuring, "Oh, hold me, love me if you can. Am I hateful? This is me. These are your arms." The doctor in the next room moved in his chair. The noise awoke her from her dream of contentment, and she unwound the dead arm from her neck and, holding it up by the wrist, considered it ruefully. "Yes, I can put it round me, but I have to hold it there. It is quite cold. It doesn't care. Oh, my dear, you don't care. You are dead. I kiss you, but you don't kiss me. Edward, oh, for heaven's sake, kiss me once, just once." No, that won't do. It's not enough. It's nothing. It's worse than nothing. I want you back, all you. What shall I do? I often pray. If there be a God in heaven, and if he ever answered a prayer, let him answer mine, my only prayer. I will never ask another, and give you back to me, as you were, as I loved you, as I adored you. He must listen, he must. My God, he is mine. He's my husband. He's my lover. Give him back to me. Left alone for half an hour more with the corpse? It's not right. The muttered expression of the nurse's revolted sense of professional decency came from the head of the staircase where she had been waiting for the last few minutes. The doctor joined her. "Hush, Mrs. Joyce. I'll go to her now." The door creaked on its hinges as he gently pushed it open and went in. What's that? Screamed Mrs. Arne. Doctor, don't touch me. Either I am dead or he is alive." "Do you want to kill yourself, Mrs. Arne?" said Dr. Graham, with calculated sternness, coming forward. "Come away." Not dead, she murmured. "He is dead, I assure you, dead and cold an hour ago. Feel!" He took hold of her as she lay face downward, and in so doing he touched the dead man's cheek. It was not cold. Instinctively his finger sought a pulse. "Stop! Wait!" he cried in his intense excitement. "My dear Mrs. Arne, control yourself." But Mrs. Arne had fainted and fallen heavily off the bed on the other side. Her sister, hastily summoned, attended to her, while the man they had all given over for dead was, with faint gasps and sighs and reluctant moans, pulled, as it were, hustled and dragged back over the threshold of life. Part 2. "Why do you always wear black, Alice?" asked Esther Graham. "You are not in mourning that I know of." She was Dr. Graham's only daughter and Mrs. Arne's only friend. She sat with Mrs. Arne in the dreary drawing-room of the house in Chelsea. She had come to tea. She was the only person who ever did come to tea there. She was brusque, kind, and blunt, and had a talent for making inappropriate remarks. 6 years ago, Mrs. Arne had been a widow for an hour. Her husband had succumbed to an apparently mortal illness, and for the space of an hour had lain dead. When suddenly and inexplicably he had revived from his trance, the shock, combined with 6 weeks' nursing, had nearly killed his wife. All this Esther had heard from her father. She herself had only come to know Mrs. Arne after her child was born and all the tragic circumstances of her husband's illness put aside and, it was hoped, forgotten. And when her idle question received no answer from the pale, absent woman who sat opposite, with listless, lackluster eyes fixed on the green and blue flames dancing in the fire, she hoped it had passed unnoticed. She waited for 5 minutes for Mrs. Arne to resume the conversation, then her natural impatience got the better of her. "Do say something, Alice," she implored. "Esther, I beg your pardon," said Mrs. Arne. "I was thinking." "What were you thinking of?" "I don't know." "No, of course you don't. People who sit and stare into the fire never do think, really. They're only brooding and making themselves ill, and that is what you are doing. You mope, you take no interest in anything, you never go out. I'm sure you've not been out of doors today." "No. Oh, yes. I believe not. It is so cold." "You are sure to feel the cold if you sit in the house all day, and sure to get ill. Just look at yourself." Mrs. Arne rose and looked at herself in the Italian mirror over the chimney-piece. It reflected faithfully enough her even pallor, her dark hair and eyes, the sweeping length of her eyelashes, the sharp curves of her nostrils, and the delicate arch of her eyebrows that formed a very thin, sharp black line, so clear as to seem almost unnatural. "Yes, I do look ill," she said with conviction. "No wonder. You choose to bury yourself alive." "Sometimes I do feel as if I lived in a grave. I look up at the ceiling and fancy it is my coffin lid." "Don't please talk like that," expostulated Miss Graham, pointing to Mrs. Arne's little girl. "If only for Dolly's sake. I think you should not give way to such morbid fancies. It isn't good for her to see you like this always." "Oh, Esther," the other exclaimed, stung into something like vivacity. "Don't reproach me. I hope I am a good mother to my child." "Yes, dear, you are a model mother, and a model wife, too. Father says the way you look after your husband is something wonderful, but don't you think for your own sake you might try to be a little gayer? You encourage these moods, don't you? What is it? Is it the house?" She glanced around her, at the high ceiling, at the heavy damask portieres, the tall cabinets of china, the dim oak paneling. It reminded her of a neglected museum. Her eye traveled into the farthest corners where the faint filmy dusk was already gathering, lit only by the bewildering crosslights of the glass panels of cabinet doors, to the tall narrow windows, then back again to the woman in her morning dress, cowering by the fire. She said sharply, "You should go out more." "I do not like to leave my husband." "Oh, I know he is delicate and all that, but still, does he never permit you to leave him? Does he never go out by himself?" "Not often." "And you have no pets? It is very odd of you. I simply cannot imagine a house without animals." "We did have a dog once," answered Mrs. Arne plaintively. "But it howled, so we had to give it away. It would not go near Edward. But please don't imagine that I am dull. I have my child." She laid her head on the flaxen head at her knee. Miss Graham rose, frowning. "You are too bad," she exclaimed. "You're like a widow exactly, with one child, stroking its orphan head and saying, 'Poor fatherless darling.'" Voices were heard outside. Miss Graham stopped talking quite suddenly and sought her veil and gloves on the mantelpiece. "You need not go, Esther," said Mrs. Arne. "It is only my husband." "Oh, but it is getting late," said the other, crumpling up her gloves in her muff and shuffling her feet nervously. "Come," said her hostess with a bitter smile. "Put your gloves on properly if you must go, but it is quite early still." "Please don't go, Miss Graham," put in the child. "I must. Go and meet your papa like a good girl." "I don't want to." "You mustn't talk like that, Dolly," said the doctor's daughter absently, still looking toward the door. Mrs. Arne rose and fastened the clasps of the big fur cloak for her friend. The wife's white, sad, oppressed face came very close to the girl's cheerful one as she murmured in a low voice, "You don't like my husband, Esther. I can't help noticing it. Why don't you?" "Nonsense," retorted the other, with the emphasis of one who is repelling an overtrue accusation. "I do, only what?" "Well, dear, it is foolish of me, of course, but I am a little afraid of him." "Afraid of Edward," said his wife slowly. "Why should you be?" Well, dear, you see, I suppose women can't help being a little afraid of their friends' husbands. They can spoil their friendships with their wives in a moment if they choose to disapprove of them. I really must go. Goodbye, child. Give me a kiss. Don't ring, Alice. Please don't. I can open the door for myself. Why should you? Said Mrs. Arne. Edward is in the hall. I heard him speaking to Foster. No, he has gone into his study. Goodbye, you apathetic creature. She gave Mrs. Arne a brief kiss and dashed out of the room. The voices outside had ceased, and she had reasonable hopes of reaching the door without being intercepted by Mrs. Arne's husband. But he met her on the stairs. Mrs. Arne, listening intently from her seat by the fire, heard her exchange a few shy sentences with him, the sound of which died away as they went downstairs together. A few moments after, Edward Arne came into the room and dropped into the chair just vacated by his wife's visitor. He crossed his legs and said nothing. Neither did she. His nearness had the effect of making the woman look at once several years older. Where she was pale, he was well-colored. The network of little filmy wrinkles that, on close inspection, covered her face had no parallel on his smooth skin. He was handsome. Soft, well-groomed flakes of auburn hair lay over his forehead, and his steely blue eyes shone equably in contrast to the somber fire of hers and the masses of dark, crinkly hair that shaded her brow. The deep lines of permanent discontent furrowed that brow as she sat with her chin propped on her hands and her elbows resting on her knees. Neither spoke. When the hands of the clock over Mrs. Arne's head pointed to 7, the whiter-aproned figure of the nurse appeared in the doorway, and the little girl rose and kissed her mother very tenderly. Mrs. Arne's forehead contracted. Looking uneasily at her husband, she said to the child tentatively, yet boldly, as one grasps a nettle, "Say good night to your father." The child obeyed, saying, "Good night," indifferently, in her father's direction. "Kiss him." "No, please not." Her mother looked down on her curiously, sadly. "You are a naughty, spoilt child," she said, but without conviction. "Excuse her, Edward." He did not seem to have heard. "Well, if you don't care," said his wife bitterly. "Come, child." She caught the little girl by the hand and left the room. At the door she half turned and looked fixedly at her husband. It was a strange, ambiguous gaze. In it passion and dislike were strangely combined. Then she shivered and closed the door softly after her. The man in the armchair sat with no perceptible change of attitude, his unspeculative eyes fixed on the fire, his hands clasped idly in front of him. The pose was obviously habitual. The servant brought lights and closed the shutters, drew the curtains, and made up the fire noisily, without, however, eliciting any reproof from his master. Edward Arne was an ideal master as far as Foster was concerned. He kept cases of cigars, but never smoked them, although the supply had often to be renewed. He did not care what he ate or drank, although he kept as good a cellar as most gentlemen. Foster knew that. He never interfered, he counted for nothing, he gave no trouble. Foster had no intention of ever leaving such an easy place. True, his master was not cordial. He very seldom addressed him or seemed to know whether he was there, but then neither did he grumble if the fire in the study was allowed to go out, or interfere with Foster's liberty in any way. He had a better place of it than Annette, Mrs. Arne's maid, who would be called up in the middle of the night to bathe her mistress's forehead with eau de cologne, or made to brush her long hair for hours together to soothe her. Naturally enough, Foster and Annette compared notes as to their respective situations, and drew unflattering parallels between this capricious wife and model husband. Part 3. Miss Graham was not a demonstrative woman. On her return home, she somewhat startled her father as he sat by his study table, deeply interested in his diagnosis book, by the sudden violence of her embrace. "Why this excitement?" he asked, smiling and turning around. He was a young-looking man for his age. His thin, wiry figure and clear color belied the evidence in his hair, tinged with gray, and the tired wrinkles that gave value to the acuteness and brilliancy of the eyes they surrounded. "I don't know," she replied. "Only you are so nice and alive somehow. I always feel like this when I come back from seeing the Arnes." Well, then don't go see the Arns. I am so fond of her, Father, and she will never come here to me, as you know, or else nothing would induce me to enter her tomb of a house and talk to that walking funeral of a husband of hers. I managed to get away today without having to shake hands with him. I always try to avoid it. But, Father, I do wish you would go and see Alice. Is she ill? Well, not exactly ill, I suppose, but her eyes make me quite uncomfortable, and she says such odd things. I don't know if it's you or the clergyman she wants, but she is all wrong somehow. She never goes out except to church. She never pays a call or has anyone to call on her. Nobody ever asks the Arns to dinner, and I'm sure I don't blame them. The sight of that man at one's table would spoil any party, and they never entertain. She is always alone. Day after day I go in and find her sitting over the fire with that same brooding expression. I shouldn't be surprised in the least if she were to go mad some day. Father, what is it? What is the tragedy of the house? There is one, I'm convinced, and yet, though I've been the intimate friend of that woman for years, I know no more about her than the man on the street. She keeps her skeleton safe in the cupboard, said Dr. Graham. I respect her for that. And please don't talk nonsense about tragedies. Alice Arn is only morbid, the malady of the age, and she is a very religious woman. I wonder if she complains of her odious husband to Mr. Bligh. She is always going to his services. Odious? Yes, odious, Miss Graham shuddered. I cannot stand him. I cannot bear the touch of his cold, froggy hands and the sight of his fishy eyes. That inane smile of his simply makes me shrivel up. Father, honestly, do you like him yourself? My dear, I hardly know him. It is his wife I've known ever since she was a child, and I a boy at college. Her father was my tutor. I never knew her husband till 6 years ago, when she called me in to attend him in a very serious illness. I suppose she never speaks of it? No? A very odd affair. For the life of me, I cannot tell how he managed to recover. You needn't tell people, for it affects my reputation, but I didn't save him. Indeed, I've never been able to account for it. The man was given over for dead. He might as well be dead for all the good he is, said Esther scornfully. I've never heard him say more than a couple sentences in my life. Yet he was an exceedingly brilliant young man, one of the best men of his year at Oxford, a good deal run after. Poor Alice was wild to marry him. In love with that spiritless creature? He's like a house with someone dead in it and all the blinds down. Come, Esther, don't be morbid, not to say silly. You are very hard on the poor man. What's wrong with him? He's the ordinary, commonplace, cold-blooded specimen of humanity, a little stupid, a little selfish. People who have gone through a serious illness like that are apt to be, but on the whole a good husband, a good father, a good citizen. Yes, and his wife is afraid of him, and his child hates him, exclaimed Esther. Nonsense, said Dr. Graham sharply. The child is spoilt. Only children are apt to be, and the mother wants a change or a tonic of some kind. I'll go and talk to her when I have time. Go along and dress. Have you forgotten that George Graham is coming to dinner? After she had gone, the doctor made a note on the corner of his blotting pad. Memo. Go and see Mrs. Arn, and dismiss the subject of the memorandum entirely from his mind. George Graham was the doctor's nephew, a tall, weedy, cumbrous young man, full of fads and fallacies, with a gentle manner that somehow inspired confidence. He was several years younger than Esther, who loved to listen to his semi-scientific, semi-romantic stories of things he met with in the course of his profession. Oh, I come across very queer things, he would say mysteriously. There's a queer little widow. Tell me about your little widow, asked Esther that day after dinner, when, her father having gone back to his study, she and her cousin sat together as usual. He laughed. You like to hear of my professional experiences. Well, she certainly interested me, he said thoughtfully. She is an odd psychological study in her way. I wish I could come across her again. Where did you come across her, and what is her name? I don't know her name. I don't want to. She's not a personage to me, only a case. I hardly know her face, even. I've never seen it except in the twilight. But I gathered that she lived somewhere in Chelsea, for she came out onto the embankment with only a kind of lacy thing over her head. She can't live far off, I fancy. Esther became instantly attentive. Go on, she said. It was 3 weeks ago, said George Graham. I was coming along the embankment about 10 o'clock. I walked through that little grove, just between Cheney Walk and the river, and I heard in there someone sobbing very bitterly. I looked and saw a woman sitting on a seat with her head in her hands, crying. I was most awfully sorry, of course, and I thought I could perhaps do something for her, get her a glass of water or salts or something. I took her for a woman of the people. It was quite dark, so I asked her very politely if I could do anything for her, and then I noticed her hands. They were quite white and covered with diamonds. You were sorry you spoke, I suppose, said Esther. She raised her head and said, I believe she laughed, Are you going to tell me to move on? She thought you were a policeman. Probably, if she thought at all, but she was in a semi-dazed condition. I told her to wait till I came back and dashed around the corner to the chemist's and bought a bottle of salts. She thanked me and made a little effort to rise and go away. She seemed very weak. I told her I was a medical man. I started in and talked to her. And she to you? Yes, quite straight. Don't you know that women always treat a doctor as if he were one step removed from their father confessor, not human, not in the same category as themselves? It is not complimentary to one as a man, but one hears a good deal one would not otherwise hear. She ended by telling me all about herself, in a veiled way, of course. It soothed her, relieved her. She seemed to have not had an outlet for years. To a mere stranger. To a doctor. And she did not know what she was saying half the time. She was hysterical, of course. Heavens, what nonsense she talked. She spoke of herself as a person somehow haunted, cursed by some malign fate, a victim of some fearful spiritual catastrophe, don't you know? I let her run on. She was convinced of the reality of a sort of doom that she had fancied had befallen her. It was quite pathetic. Then it got rather chilly. She shivered. I suggested her going in. She shrank back and she said, If you only knew what a relief it is, how much less miserable I am out here. I can breathe. I can live. It is my only glimpse of the world that is alive. I live in a grave. Oh, let me stay. She seemed positively afraid to go home. Perhaps someone bullied her at home. I suppose so, but then she had no husband. He died, she told me, years ago. She had adored him, she said. Is she pretty? Pretty? Well, I hardly noticed. Let me see. Yes, I suppose she was pretty. No, now that I think of it, she would be too worn and faded to be what you call pretty. Esther smiled. Well, we sat there for quite an hour, and then the clock of Chelsea Church struck 11, and she got up and said goodbye, holding out her hand quite naturally, as if our meeting and conversation had been nothing out of the common. There was a sound like a dead leaf trailing across the walk, and she was gone. Didn't you ask if you should see her again? That would have been a mean advantage to take. You might have offered to see her home. I saw she didn't mean me to. She was a lady, you say, pondered Esther. How was she dressed? Oh, all right, like a lady. In black, mourning, I suppose. She has dark, crinkly hair, and her eyebrows are very thin and arched. I noticed that in the dusk. Does this photograph remind you of her? Asked Esther suddenly, taking him to the mantelpiece. Rather. Alice? Oh, it couldn't be. She is not a widow. Her husband is alive. Has your friend any children? Yes, one. She mentioned it. How old? 6 years old, I think she said. She talks of the responsibility of bringing up an orphan. George, what time is it? Esther asked suddenly. About 9 o'clock. Would you mind coming out with me? I should like it. Where shall we go? To St. Adhelm's. It's close by here. There's a special late service tonight, and Mrs. Arne is sure to be there. Oh, Esther, curiosity. No, not mere curiosity. Don't you see, if it is my Mrs. Arne who talked to you like that, it is very serious. I have thought her ill for a long time, but as ill as that? At St. Adhelm's Church, Esther Graham pointed out a woman who was kneeling beside a pillar in an attitude of intense devotion and abandonment. She rose from her knees and turned her rapt face up toward the pulpit whence the Reverend Ralph Bly was holding his impassioned discourse. George Graham touched his cousin on the shoulder and motioned to her to leave her place on the outermost rank of worshippers. That is the woman, said he. Part 4. Memo. To go and see Mrs. Arne. The doctor came across this note in his blotting pad one day 6 weeks later. His daughter was out of town. He had heard nothing of the Arnes since her departure. He had promised to go and see her. He was a little conscience-stricken. Yet another week elapsed before he found time to call upon the daughter of his old tutor. At the corner of Tite Street he met Mrs. Arne's husband and stopped. A doctor's professional kindliness of manner is, or ought to be, independent of his personal likings and dislikings, and there was a pleasant cordiality about his greeting which should have provoked a corresponding fervor on the part of Edward Arne. "How are you, Arne?" Graham said. "I was on my way to call on your wife." Yes," said Edward Arne, with the ascending inflection of polite acquiescence. A ray of blue from his eyes rested transitorily on the doctor's face, and in that short moment the latter noted its intolerable vacuity, and for the first time in his life felt a sharp pang of sympathy for the wife of such a husband. "I suppose you were off to your club. Goodbye," he wound up abruptly. With the best will in the world, he somehow found it almost impossible to carry on a conversation with Edward Arne, who raised his hand to his hat brim in token of salutation, smiled sweetly, and walked on. "He really is extraordinarily good-looking," reflected the doctor as he watched him down the street and safely over the crossing with a certain degree of solicitude for which he could not exactly account. And yet one feels one's vitality ebbing out at the finger ends as one talks to him. I shall begin to believe in Esther's absurd fancies about him soon. There's the little girl," he exclaimed, as he turned onto Cheyne Walk and caught sight of her with her nurse, making violent demonstrations to attract his attention. "She is alive, at any rate. How is your mother, Dolly?" he asked. "Quite well, thank you," was the child's reply. She added, "She's crying. She sent me away because I looked at her. So I did. Her cheeks are quite red." Run away and play," said the doctor nervously. He ascended the steps of the house and rang the bell very gently and neatly. "Not at—" began Foster with the intonation of polite falsehood, but stopped on seeing the doctor, who, with his daughter, was a privileged person. "Mrs. Arne will see you, sir." "Mrs. Arne is not alone?" he asked interrogatively. "Yes, sir, quite alone. I've just taken tea in." Dr. Graham's doubts were prompted by the low murmur as of a voice, or voices, which came to him through the open door of the room at the head of the stairs. He paused and listened while Foster stood by, merely remarking, "Mrs. Arne do talk to herself sometimes, sir." It was Mrs. Arne's voice. The doctor recognized it now. It was not the voice of a sane or healthy woman. He at once mentally removed his visit from the category of a morning call and prepared for a semi-professional inquiry. "Don't announce me," he said to Foster, and quietly entered the back drawing-room, which was separated by a heavy tapestry portiere from the room where Mrs. Arne sat, with an open book on the table before her, from which she had apparently been reading aloud. Her hands were now clasped tightly over her face, and when, presently, she removed them and began feverishly to turn page after page of her book, the crimson of her cheeks was seamed with white where her fingers had impressed themselves. The doctor wondered if she saw him, for though her eyes were fixed in his direction, there was no apprehension in them. She went on reading, and it was the text, mingled with passionate interjection and fragmentary utterances, of the burial service that met his ears. "For as in Adam all die." All die? It says all. "For he must reign. The last enemy that shall be destroyed is death. What shall they do if the dead rise not at all? I die daily. No. Better get it over. Dead and buried. Out of sight, out of mind, under a stone. Dead men don't come back. Go on, get it over. I want to hear the earth rattle on the coffin, and then I shall know it is done. Flesh and blood cannot inherit. What did I do? What have I done? Why did I wish it so fervently? Why did I pray for it so earnestly? God gave me my wish." Alice, groaned the doctor. She looked up. "When this corruptible shall have put on incorruption, dust to dust, ashes to ashes, earth to earth, yes, that is it. after death, the worms destroy the body. She flung the book aside and sobbed. That is what I'm afraid of. God, my God, down there, in the dark, forever and ever. I couldn't bear to think of it. My Edward. And so I interfered and prayed and prayed until, I am punished. Flesh and blood could not inherit. I kept him there. I would not let him go. I kept him. I prayed. I denied him Christian burial. How could I know? Good heavens, Alice, said Graham, coming sensibly forward. What does this mean? I have heard of schoolgirls going through the marriage service by themselves, but the burial service... He laid down his hat and went on severely. What have you to do with such things? Your child is flourishing, your husband alive and here. And who kept him here? Interrupted Alice Arne fiercely, accepting the fact of his appearance without comment. You did, he answered quickly, with your care and tenderness. I believe the warmth of your body as you lay beside him for that half hour maintained the vital heat during that extraordinary suspension of the heart's action which made us all give him up for dead. You were his best doctor and brought him back to us. Yes, it was I. You need not tell me it was I. Come, be thankful, he said cheerfully. Put that book away and give me some tea. I'm very cold. Oh, Dr. Graham, how thoughtless of me, said Mrs. Arne, rallying at the slight imputation to her politeness that he had purposely made. She tottered to the bell and rang it before he could anticipate her. Another cup, she said, quite calmly to Foster, who answered it. Then she sat down, quivering all over with the suddenness of the constraint put upon her. Yes, sit down and tell me all about it, said Dr. Graham good-humoredly, at the same time observing her with the closeness he gave to difficult cases. There's nothing to tell, she said simply, shaking her head and futilely altering the position of the teacups on the tray. It all happened years ago. Nothing can be done now. Will you have sugar? He drank his tea and made conversation. He talked to her of some Dante lectures she was attending, of some details connected with her child's kindergarten classes. These subjects did not interest her. There was a subject she wished to discuss. He could see that a question trembled on her tongue and tried to lead up to it. She introduced it herself, quite quietly, over a second cup. Sugar, Dr. Graham? I forget. Dr. Graham, tell me, do you believe that prayers, wicked, unreasonable prayers, are granted? He helped himself to another slice of bread and butter before answering. Well, he said slowly, it seems hard to believe that every fool who has a voice to pray with and a brain where to conceive idiotic requests with should be permitted to interfere with the economy of the universe. As a rule, if people were long-sighted enough to see the results of their petitions, I fancy very few of us would venture to interfere. Mrs. Arne groaned. She was a good churchwoman, Graham knew, and he did not wish to sap her faith in any way, so he said no more, but inwardly wondered if a too rigid interpretation of some of the religious dogmas of the vicar of St. Adhelm's, her spiritual adviser, was not the clue to her distress. Then she put another question. What? He said. Do I believe in ghosts? I will believe you if you will tell me you have seen one. You know, Doctor, she went on, I was always afraid of ghosts, of spirits, things unseen. I couldn't ever read about them. I couldn't bear the idea of someone in the room with me that I couldn't see. There was a text that always frightened me that hung up in my room, Thou, God, seest me. It frightened me when I was a child, whether I had been doing wrong or not. But now, shuddering, I think there are worse things than ghosts. Well, now, what sort of things? He asked good-humoredly. Astral bodies? She leaned forward and laid her hot hand on his. Oh, Doctor, tell me, if a spirit, without the body we know it by, is terrible, what of a body? Her voice sank to a whisper. A body, senseless, lonely, stranded on this earth, without a spirit. She was watching his face anxiously. He was divided between a morbid inclination to laugh and the feeling of intense discomfort provoked by this wretched scene. He longed to give the conversation a more cheerful turn, yet did not wish to offend her by changing it too abruptly. "I have heard of people not being able to keep body and soul together," he replied at last, "but I'm not aware that practically such a division of forces has ever been achieved. And if we could only accept that the theory of the despiritualized body, what a number of apathetic people now wandering about in the world would it account for?" The piteous gaze of her eyes seemed to seek to ward off the blow of his misplaced jocularity. He left his seat and sat down on the couch beside her. "Poor child, poor girl. You are ill, you are overexcited. What is it? Tell me," he asked her as tenderly as the father she had lost early in life might have done. Her head sank on his shoulder. "Are you unhappy?" he asked her gently. "Yes." "You are too much alone. Get your mother or your sister to come and stay with you." "They won't come," she wailed. "They say the house is like a grave. Edward has made himself a study in the basement. It's an impossible room, but he has moved all his things in it, and I won't go to him there." "You're wrong. It's only a fad," said Graham. "He'll tire of it, and you must see more people somehow. It's a pity my daughter is away. Had you any visitors today?" "Not a soul has crossed the threshold for 18 days. "We must change all that," said the doctor vaguely. "Meantime, you must cheer up. What, you have no need to think of ghosts and graves. No need to be melancholy. You have your husband and your child." "I have my child, yes." The doctor took hold of Mrs. Arne by the shoulder and held her a little way away from him. He thought he had found the cause of her trouble, a more commonplace one than he had supposed. "I have known you, Alice, since you were a child," he said gravely. "Answer me. You love your husband, don't you?" "Yes." It was as if she were answering futile prefatory questions in the witness box, yet he saw by the intense excitement in her eyes that he had come to the point she feared, yet desired to bring forward. "And he loves you?" She was silent. "Well, then, if you love each other, what more can you want? Why do you say you have only your child in that absurd way?" She was still silent, and he gave her a little shake. "Tell me, have you and he had any differences lately? Is there any coldness, any temporary estrangement between you?" He was hardly prepared for the burst of foolish laughter that proceeded from the demure Mrs. Arne as she rose and confronted him, all the blood in her body seeming for the moment to rush to her usually pale cheeks. "Coldness? Temporary estrangement? If that were all... Oh, is everyone blind but me? There is all the world between us, all the difference between this world and the next." She sat down again beside the doctor and whispered into her ear, and her words were like a breath of hot wind from some Gehenna of the soul. "Oh, doctor, I have borne it for 6 years, and I must speak. No other woman could bear what I have borne and yet be alive. And I loved him so, you don't know how I loved him. That was it. That was my crime." "Crime?" repeated the doctor. "Yes, crime. It was impious, don't you see? But I have been punished. Oh, doctor, you don't know what my life is. Listen, I must tell you. To live with At first, before I guessed when I used to put my arms around him and he merely submitted, and then it dawned on me what I was kissing. It is enough to turn a living woman into stone, for I am living, though sometimes I forget it. Yes, I am a live woman, though I live in a grave. Think what it is. To wonder every night if you will be alive in the morning, to lie down every night in an open grave, to smell death in every corner, every room, to breathe death, to touch it." The portiere in front of the door shook, a hoopstick parted it, a round, white-clad bundle supported on a pair of mottled red legs peeped in, pushing a hoop in front of her. The child made no noise. Mrs. Arne seemed to have heard her, however. She slewed around violently as she sat on the sofa beside Dr. Graham, leaving her hot hands clasped in his. "You ask Dolly," she exclaimed. She knows it too. She feels it. No, Alice, this won't do, the doctor adjured her very low. Then he raised his voice and ordered the child from the room. He had managed to lift Mrs. Arne's feet and laid her full length on the sofa by the time the maid reappeared. She had fainted. He pulled down her eyelids and satisfied himself as to certain facts he had up till now dimly apprehended. When Mrs. Arne's maid returned, he gave her mistress over to her care and proceeded to Edward Arne's new study in the basement. Morphia, he muttered to himself as he stumbled and faltered through gaslit passages where furtive servants eyed him and scuttled to their burrows. What is he burying himself down here for, he thought. Is it to get out of her way? They are a nervous pair of them. Arne was sunk in a large armchair drawn up before the fire. There was no other light, except a faint reflection from the gas lamp in the road, striking down past the iron bars of the window that was sunk below the level of the street. The room was comfortless and empty. There was little furniture in it except a large bookcase at Arne's right hand and a table with a tantalus on it standing some way off. There was a faded portrait in pastel of Alice Arne over the mantelpiece, and beside it a poor pendant, a pen and ink sketch of the master of the house. They were quite discrepant in size and medium, but they appeared to look at each other with the stolid attentiveness of newly married people. "Seedy, Arne?" Graham said. "Rather, today. Poke the fire for me, will you?" "I've known you quite 7 years," said the doctor cheerfully, "so I presume I can do that. There now, and I'll presume a little further. What have we got here?" He took a small bottle smartly out of Edward Arne's fingers and raised his eyebrows. Edward Arne had rendered it up agreeably. He did not seem upset or annoyed. "Morphia. It isn't a habit. I only got a hold of the stuff yesterday. Found it about the house. Alice was very jumpy all day and communicated her nerves to me, I suppose. I've none as a rule, but do you know, Graham, I seem to be getting them. Feel things a good deal more than I did, and want to talk about them." "What, are you growing sole?" said the doctor carelessly, lighting a cigarette. "Heaven forbid," Arne answered equably. "I've done very well without it all these years. But I'm fond of old Alice, you know, in my own way. When I was a young man, I was quite different. I took things hardly and got excited about them. Yes, excited. I was wild about Alice. Wild. Yes, by Jove, although she has forgotten all about it." "Not that, but it's still natural she should long for some little demonstration of affection now and then, and she'd be awfully distressed if she saw you fooling with that bottle of morphia. You know, Arne, after that narrow squeak you had about 5 years ago, Alice and I have a good right to consider your life belongs to us." Edward Arne settled in his chair and replied rather fretfully, "All very well, but you didn't manage to do the job thoroughly. You didn't turn me out lively enough to please Alice. She's annoyed because when I take her in my arms, I don't hold her tight enough. I'm too quiet, too languid. Well, hang it all, Graham, I think she'd like me to stand for Parliament. Why can't you just let me go along my own way? Surely a man who's come through an illness like mine can be let off of parlor tricks. All this worry. It culminated the other day when I said I wanted to colonize a room down here, and did, with a spurt that took it out of me horribly. All this worry, I say, seeing her upset and so on, keeps me low, and so I feel as if I wanted to take drugs to soothe me." "Soothe?" said Graham. "This stuff is more than soothing if you take enough of it. I'll send you something more like what you want, and take this away, by your leave." "I really can't argue," replied Arne. "If you see Alice, tell her you find me fairly comfortable, and don't put her off this room. I really like it best. She can come and see me here. I keep a good fire. Tell her. I feel as if I wanted to sleep," he added brusquely. "You have been indulging already," said Graham softly. Arne had begun to doze off. His cushion had sagged down, and the doctor stooped to rearrange it, carelessly laying the little phial for the moment in a crease of rug covering the man's knees. Mrs. Arne, in her morning dress, was crossing the hall as he came to the top of the basement steps and pushed open the swing door. She was giving some orders to Foster, the butler, who disappeared as the doctor advanced. "You're about again," he said. "Good girl." "Too silly of me," she said, "to be hysterical. After all these years, one should be able to keep one's own counsel. But it's over now, I promise. I will never speak of it again." "We frightened poor little Dolly dreadfully," I had to order her out like a regiment of soldiers. Yes, I know, I'm going to her now. On his suggestion that she should look in on her husband, first she looked askance. Down there? Yes, that's his fancy. Let him be. He's a good deal depressed about himself and you. He notices a great deal more than you think. He isn't quite as apathetic as you describe him to be. Come here. He led her into the unlit dining room a little way. You expect too much, my dear. You do really. You make too many demands on the vitality you saved. What did one save him for? She asked fiercely. She continued more quietly. I know. I'm going to be different. Not you, said Graham fondly. He was very partial to Alice Arne in spite of her silliness. You'll worry about Edward till the end of the chapter, I know you. And, he took her round by the shoulder so she fronted the light in the hall. You elusive thing, let me have a good look at you. Your eyes, they're a bit starey. He let her go again with a sigh of impotence. Something must be done, soon. He must think. He got hold of his coat and began to get into it. Mrs. Arne smiled, buttoned a button for him, and then opened the front door, like a good hostess, a very little way. With a quick flirt of his hat, he was gone, and she heard the clap of his brougham door and the order, home. Been saying goodbye to that thief Graham? Said her husband gently when she entered his room, her pale eyes staring a little, her thin hand busy at the front of her dress. A thief? Why? One moment, where's your switch? She found it and turned on a blaze of light from which her husband seemed to shrink. Well, he carried off my drops. Afraid of poisoning myself, I suppose. Or acquiring the morphia habit, said his wife in a dull, level voice, as I have. She paused. He made no comment. Then, picking up the little file Dr. Graham had left in the crease of the rug, she spoke. You are the thief, Edward, as it happens. This is mine. Is it? I found it knocking about. I didn't know it was yours. Well, will you give me some? I will, if you like. Well, dear, decide. You know I am in your hands and Graham's. He was rubbing that into me today. Poor lamb, she said derisively. I'd not allow my doctor, or my wife either, to dictate to me whether I should put an end to myself or not. Oh, but you've got spirit, you see, Arne yawned. However, let me have a go at the stuff, and then you put it on top of a wardrobe or a shelf where I shall know it is, but shall never reach out to get it, I promise you. No, you wouldn't reach out a hand to keep yourself alive, let alone kill yourself, said she. That is you all over, Edward. And don't you see that is why I did die, he said, with earnestness unexpected by her. And then, unfortunately, you and Graham bustled up and wouldn't let nature take its course. I rather wish you hadn't been so officious. And let you stay dead, said she, carelessly. But at the time I cared for you so much that I should have had to kill myself, or commit sati like a Bengali widow. She reached out for a glass half full of water that stood on the low ledge of a bookcase close by the arm of his chair. Will this glass do? What's in it? Only water. How much morphia shall I give you? An overdose? I don't care if you do, and that's a fact. It was a joke, Edward, she said piteously. No joke to me. This fag end of life I've clawed hold of doesn't interest me, and I'm bound to be interested in what I'm doing, or I'm no good. I'm no earthly good now. I don't enjoy life. I've nothing to enjoy it with in here. He struck his breast. It's like a dull party one goes to by accident. All I want to do is to get into a cab and go home. His wife stood over him with the half-full glass in one hand and the little bottle in the other. Her eyes dilated. Her chest heaved. Edward, she breathed. Was it all so useless? Was what useless? Yes. As I was telling you, I go as one in a dream, a bad dream, like the dreams I used to have when I was overworked at college. I was brilliant, Alice, brilliant, do you hear? At some cost, I expect. Now I hate people, my fellow creatures. I've left them. They come and go, jostling me and pushing me on the pavements as I go along, avoiding them. Do you know where they should be, really, in relation to me?" He rose a little in his seat. She stepped nervously aside, made as if to put down the bottle and the glass she was holding, then thought better of it, and continued to extend them mechanically. "They should be over my head. I've already left them and their petty nonsense of living. They mean nothing to me, no more than if they were ghosts walking. Or perhaps it's I who am a ghost to them. You don't understand. It's because I suppose you have no imagination. You just know what you want and do your best to get it. You blurt out your blessed petition to your deity, and the idea that you're irrelevant never enters your head, soft, persistent, high church thing that you are." Alice Arne smiled and balanced the object she was holding. He motioned her to pour out the liquid from one to the other, but she took no heed. She was listening with all her ears. It was the nearest approach to the language of compliment, to anything in the way of lover-like personalities that she had heard fall from his lips since his illness. He went on, becoming, as it were, lukewarm to his subject. "But the worst of it is that once break the cord that links you to humanity, it can't be mended. Man doesn't live by bread alone, or lives to disappoint you. What am I to you without my own poor personality? Don't stare so, Alice. I haven't talked so much or so intimately for ages, have I? Let me try and have it out. Are you in any sort of hurry?" "No, Edward." "Pour that stuff out and have done. Alice, it's a queer feeling, I tell you. One goes about with one's looks on the ground like a man who eyes the bed he is going to lay down in and longs for. Alice, the crust of the earth seems a barrier between me and my own place. I want to scratch the boardings with my nails and shriek something like this, 'Let me get down to you all, down where I belong.' It's a horrible sensation, like a vampire reversed." "Is that why you insisted on having this room in the basement?" she asked breathlessly. "Yes. I can't bear being upstairs somehow. Here, with these barred windows and stone-cold floors, I can see the people's feet walking above there on the street. One has some sort of illusion." "Oh." She shivered, and her eyes traveled like those of a caged creature around the bare room, and fluttered when they rested on the somber windows imperiously barred. She dropped her gaze to the stone flags that showed beyond the oasis of turkey carpet on which Arne's chair stood. Then to the door that she had closed on entering. It had heavy bolts, but they were not drawn against her, though by the look of her eyes it seemed she half imagined they were. She made a step forward and moved her hands slightly. She looked down on them and what they held, then changed the relative positions of the two objects and held the bottle over the glass. "Yes, come along," her husband said. "Are you going to be all day giving it me?" With a jerk, she poured the liquid out into the glass and handed it to him. She looked away, toward the door. Your way of escape," said he, following her eyes. Then he drank, painstakingly. The empty bottle fell out of her hands. She wrung them, murmuring, "Oh, if I had only known." "Known what? That I should go near to cursing you for bringing me back?" He fixed his cold eyes on her as the liquid passed slowly over his tongue. "Or that you would end by taking back the gift you gave." In the days when Murtough MacAirca was in the High Kingship of Ireland, the country was divided between the old beliefs of paganism and the new doctrines of the Christian teaching. Part held with the old creed and part with the new, and the thought of the people was troubled between them, for they knew not which way to follow and which to forsake. The faith of their forefathers hung close around them, holding them by many fine and tender threads of memory and custom and tradition. Yet still the new faith was making its way, and every day it spread wider and wider through the land. The family of Murtough had joined itself to the Christian faith, and his 3 brothers were bishops and abbots of the church, but Murtough himself remained a pagan, for he was a wild and lawless prince, and the peaceful teachings of the Christian doctrine, with its forgiveness of enemies, pleased him not at all. Fierce and cruel was his life, filled with dark deeds and bloody wars, and savage and tragic was his death, as we shall hear. Now Murtough was in the sunny summer palace of Cletty, which Cormac, son of Art, had built for a pleasure house on the brink of the slow-flowing Boyne, near the fairy brook of Angus the ever-young, the god of youth and beauty. A day of summer was that day, and the king came forth to hunt on the borders of the brook, with all his boon companions around him. But when the high noon came, the sun grew hot, and the king sat down to rest upon the fairy mound, and the hunt passed on behind him, and he was left alone. There was a witch-woman in that country, whose name was Sigh, Sough, Storm, Rough Wind, Winter Night, Cry, Wail, and Groan. Star-bright and beautiful was she in face and form, but inwardly she was as cruel as her names. And she hated Murtough, because he had scattered and destroyed the ancient peoples of the fairy tribes of Erin, her country and her fatherland. And because in the battle which he fought at Surb on the Boyne, her father and her mother and her sister had been slain, for in those days women went to battle side by side with men. She knew, too, that with the coming of the new faith, trouble would come upon the fairy folk, and their power and their great majesty would depart from them, and men would call them demons, and would drive them out with psalm-singing, and with the saying of prayers, and with the sound of little tinkling bells. So trouble and anger wrought in the witch-woman, and she waited the day to be revenged on Murtough, for he, being yet a pagan, was still within her power to harm. So when Sheen, for Sheen, or Storm, was the name men gave to her, saw the king seated on the fairy mound, and all his comrades parted from him, she arose softly, and combed her hair with her comb of silver adorned with little ribs of gold. And she washed her hands in a silver basin wherein were 4 golden birds sitting on the rim of the bowl, and little bright gems of carbuncle set round about the rim. And she donned her fairy mantle of flowing green, and her cloak wide and hooded with silvery fringes, and a brooch of fairest gold. On her head were tresses yellow like to gold, plaited in 4 locks, with a golden drop at the end of each long tress. The hue of her hair was like the flower of the iris in summer, or like red gold after the burnishing thereof. And she wore on her breasts and at her shoulders marvelous clasps of gold, finely worked with the tracery of the skilled craftsman, and a golden twisted torque around her throat. And when she was decked, she went softly and sat down beside Murtough on the turfy hunting mound. And after a space Murtough perceived her sitting there, and the sun shining upon her, so that the glittering of the gold and of her golden hair and the bright shining of the green silk of her garments was like the yellow iris beds upon the lake on a sunny summer's day. Wonder and terror seized on Murtough at her beauty, and he knew not if he loved her or if he hated her the most, for at one moment all his nature was filled with longing and with love of her, so that it seemed to him that he would give the whole of Ireland for the loan of 1 hour's space of dalliance with her. But after that he felt a dread of her, because he knew his fate was in her hands, and that she had come to work him ill. But he welcomed her as if she were known to him, and he asked her wherefore she was come. "I am come," she said, "because I am beloved of Murtough, son of Eir, king of Erin, and I come to seek him here." Then Murtough was glad, and he said, "Dost thou not know me, maiden?" "I do," she answered, "for all secret and mysterious things are known to me, and thou and all the men of Erin are well known." After he had conversed with her a while, she appeared to him so fair that the king was ready to promise her anything in life she wished, so long as she would go with him to Cletty of the Boyne. "My wish," she said, "is that you take me to your house, and that you put out from it your wife and your children, because they are of the new faith, and all the clerics that are in your house, and that neither your wife nor any cleric be permitted to enter the house while I am there." "I will give you," said the king, 100 head of every herd of cattle that is within my kingdom, and 100 drinking horns, and 100 cups, and 100 rings of gold, and a feast every other night in the summer palace of Cletty. But I pledge thee my word, O maiden, it were easier for me to give thee half of Ireland than to do this thing that thou hast asked." For Murtough feared that when those that were of the Christian faith were put out of his house, she would work her spells upon him, and no power would be left with him to resist those spells. "I will not take thy gifts," said the damsel, "but only those things that I have asked. Moreover, it is thus that my name must never be uttered by thee, nor must any man or woman learn it." "What is thy name?" said Murtough, "that it may not come upon my lips to utter it?" And she said, "Sigh, sough, storm, rough wind, winter night, cry, wail, groan, this is my name. But men call me Sheen, for storm or sheen is my chief name, and storms are with me where I come." Nevertheless, Murtough was so fascinated by her that he brought her to his home, and he drove out the clerics that were there, with his wife and children along with them, and drove out also the nobles of his own clan, the children of Nile, 2 great and gallant battalions. And Ducha, his wife, went crying along the road with her children around her to seek Bishop Carnock, the half-brother of her husband, and her own soul friend, that she might obtain help and shelter from him. But Sheen went gladly and light-heartedly into the house of Cletty, and when she saw the lovely lightsome house and the goodly nobles of the clan of Nile, and the feasting and banqueting and the playing of the minstrels, and all the joyous noise of that kingly dwelling, her heart was lifted within her, and "Fair as a fairy palace is this house of Cletty," said she. "Fair indeed it is," replied the king, "for neither the kings of Leinster nor the kings of mighty Ulster or the lords of the clans of Owen or of Niall have such a house as this. Nay, in terra of the kings itself, no house to equal this house of mine is found." And that night the king robed himself in all the splendor of his royal dignity, and on his right hand he seated Sheen, and a great banquet was made before them, and men said that never on earth was to be seen a woman more goodly of appearance than she. And the king was astonished at her, and began to ask her questions, for it seemed to him that the power of a great goddess of the ancient time was in her, and he asked her whence she came, and what manner was the power that he saw in her. He asked her, too, did she believe in the god of the clerics, or was she herself some goddess of the older world, for he feared her, feeling that his fate was in her hands. She laughed a careless and a cruel laugh, for she knew that the king was in her power, now that she was there alone with him, and the clerics and the Christian teachers gone. "Fear me not, O Murtough," she cried. "I am, like thee, a daughter of the race of men and of the ancient family of Adam and Eve, fit and meet my comradeship with thee, therefore fear not nor regret. And as to that true God of thine, worker of miracles and helper of his people, no miracle in all the world is there that I, by mine own unaided power, cannot work the like. I can create a sun and moon, the heavens I can sprinkle with the radiant stars of night. I can call up to life men fiercely fighting in conflict, slaughtering one another. Wine I could make of the cold water of the Boyne, and sheep of lifeless stones, and swine of ferns. In the presence of the hosts I can make gold and silver, plenty and to spare, and hosts of famous fighting men I can produce from naught. Now tell me, can thy God work the like?" "Work for us," says the king, "some of these great wonders." Then Sheen went forth out of the house, and she set herself to work spells on Murtough, so that he knew not whether he was in his right mind or no. She took of the water of the Boyne and made a magic wine thereout, and she took ferns and spiked thistles and light puff-balls of the woods, and out of them she fashioned magic swine and sheep and goats, and with these she fed Murtough and the hosts. And when they had eaten, all their strength went from them, and the magic wine sent them into an uneasy sleep and restless slumbers. And out of the stones and sods of earth she fashioned 3 battalions, and one of the battalions she placed at one side of the house, and the other at the further side beyond it, and one encircling the rest southward along the hollow windings of the glen. And thus were these battalions, one of them all made of men stark naked and their colour blue, and the second with heads of goats with shaggy beards and horned, but the third more terrible than they, for these were headless men, fighting like human beings, yet finished at the neck. And the sound of heavy shouting, as of hosts and multitudes, came from the first and the second battalion, but from the third no sound, save only that they waved their arms and struck their weapons together, and smote the ground with their feet impatiently. And though terrible was the shout of the blue men and the bleating of the goats with human heads, more horrible yet was the stamping and the rage of those headless men finished at the neck. And Murtough, in his sleep and in his dreams, heard the battle shout, and he rose impetuously from off his bed, but the wine overcame him, and his strength departed from him, and he fell helplessly upon the floor. Then he heard the challenge a second time, and the stamping of the feet without, and he rose again, and madly, fiercely he set on them, charging the hosts and scattering them before him, as he thought, as far as the fairy palace of the Brugh. But all his strength was lost in fighting phantoms, for they were but stones and sods and withered leaves of the forest that he took for fighting. Now Ducha, Murtaugh's wife, knew what was going on. She called upon Carnoch to arise and to gather together the clans of the children of his people, the men of Owen and of Niall, and together they went to the fort, but Sheen guarded it well, so they could by no means find an entrance. Then Carnoch was angry, and he cursed the place, and he dug a grave before the door, and he stood upon the mound of the grave, and rang his bells, and cursed the king and his house, and prophesied his downfall. But he blessed the clans of Owen and of Niall, and they returned to their own country. Then Carnoch sent messengers to seek Murtough, and to draw him away from the witch woman who sought his destruction. But because she was so lovely, the king would believe no evil of her, and whenever he made any sign to go to Carnoch, she threw her spell upon the king so that he could not break away. When he was so weak and faint that he had no power left, she cast a sleep upon him, and she went round the house, putting everything in readiness. She called upon her magic host of warriors, and set them round the fortress, with their spears and javelins pointed inward toward the house, so that the king would not dare to go out amongst them. And that night was a night of Samhain, the eve of Wednesday after All Souls' Day. Then she went everywhere throughout the house, and took lighted brands and burning torches, and scattered them in every part of the dwelling. And she returned into the room wherein Murtough slept, and lay down by his side. And she caused a great wind to spring up, and it came soughing through the house from northwest, and the king said, "This is the sigh of the winter night." And Sheen smiled because, unwittingly, the king had spoken her name, for she knew that by that the hour of her revenge had come. "'Tis I myself that am sigh in winter night," she said. "And I am rough wind and storm, a daughter of fair nobles, and I am cry and wail, the maid of elfin birth who brings ill luck to men." And after that she caused a great snowstorm to come around the house, and like the noise of troops and the rage of battle was the storm beating and pouring in on every side, so that drifts of deep snow were piled against the walls, blocking the doors and chilling the folk that were feasting within the house. But the king was lying in a heavy, unresting sleep, and Sheen was at his side. Suddenly he screamed out of his sleep and stirred himself, for he heard the crash of falling timbers and the noise of the magic hosts, and he smelled the strong smell of fire in the palace. He sprang up. "It seems to me," he cried, "that hosts of demons are about the house, and they are slaughtering my people, and that the house of Cletty is on fire." "It was but a dream," the witch maiden said. Then he slept again, and he saw a vision, to wit, that he was tossing in a ship at sea, and the ship floundered, and above his head a griffin, with a sharp beak and talons, sailed, her wings outspread and covering all the sun, so that it was dark as middle night. And lo, as she rose on high, her plumes quivered for a moment in the air, then down she swooped and picked him up from the waves, carrying him to her eyrie on the dismal cliff overhanging the ocean. And the griffin began to pierce him, and to prod him with her talons, and to pick out pieces of his flesh with her beak. And this went on a while, and then a flame that came he knew not whence rose from the nest, and he and the griffin were enveloped in the flame. Then in her beak the griffin picked him up, and together they fell downward over the cliff's edge into the seething ocean, so that, half by fire and half by water, he died a miserable death. When the king saw that vision, he rose screaming from his sleep and donned his arms, and he made one plunge forward, seeking for the magic hosts, but he found no man to answer him. The damsel went forth from the house, and Murtough made to follow her, but as he turned, the flames leapt out, and all between him and the door was one vast sheet of flame. He saw no way of escape save the vat of wine that stood in the banqueting hall, and into that he got, but the burning timbers of the roof fell upon his head, and the hails of fiery sparks rained on him, so that half of him was burned and half was drowned, as he had seen in his dream. The next day, amid the embers, the clerics found his corpse, and they took it up and washed it in the Boyne, and carried it to Tulane to bury it. And they said, "Alas, that Mac Airca, High King of Erin, of the noble race of Conn and the descendants of Ugain the Great, should die fighting with swords and stones. Alas, that the cross of Christ was not signed upon his face, that he might have known the witchdoms of the maiden for what they were." And as they went thus, bewailing the death of Murtough and bearing him to his grave, Dúcha, wife of Murtough, met them, and when she found her husband dead, she struck her hands together, and she made a great and mournful lamentation. And because weakness came upon her, she leaned her back against the ancient tree that is in Annachreal, and a burst of blood broke from her heart, and there she died, grieving for her husband. And the grave of Murtough was made wide and deep, and there they laid the queen beside him, two in the one grave, near the north side of the little church that is in Tulane. Now when the burial was finished, and the clerks were reciting over his grave the deeds of the king, and were making prayers for Murtaugh's soul, that it might be brought out of hell, for Carnoch showed great care for this, they saw coming towards them across the sward a lonely woman, star-bright and beautiful, and a kirtle of priceless silk upon her, and a green mantle with its fringes of silver thread flowing to the ground. She reached the place where the clerics were, and saluted them, and they saluted her, and they marveled at her beauty, but they perceived upon her an appearance of sadness and of heavy grief. They asked of her, "Who art thou, maiden, and wherefore art thou come to this house of mourning? For a king lies buried here." "A king lies buried here indeed," said she, "and it was I who slew him. Murtough of the many deeds, of the race of Conn and Niall, High King of Ireland and of the West. And though it was I who wrought his death, I myself will die for grief of him." And they said, "Tell us, maiden, why you brought him to his death, if so be that he was dear to thee." And she said, "Murtough was dear to me indeed, dearest of the men of the whole world. For I am Sheen, the daughter of Saig, the son of Dian, from whom Ath Sigi, or the Ford of Siege, is called today. But Murtough slew my father, and my mother and sister were slain along with him in the battle of Surb upon the Boyne, and there was none of my house to avenge their death, save myself alone. Moreover, in his time the ancient peoples of the fairy tribes of Erin were scattered and destroyed, the folk of the underworld and of my fatherland, and to avenge the wrong and the loss he wrought on them, I slew the man I loved. I made poison for him. Alas, I made for him magic drink and food which took his strength away, and out of the sods of earth and puffballs that float upon the wind, I wrought men and armies of headless, hideous folk, till all his senses were distraught. And now, take me to thee, O Carnoch, in fervent and true repentance, and sign the cross of Christ upon my brow, for the time of my death is come." Then she made penitence for the sin that she had sinned, and she died there upon the grave of grief and of sorrow after the king. And they digged a grave lengthwise across the foot of the wide grave of Murtough and his spouse, and there they laid the maiden who had wrought them woe. And the clerics wondered at these things, and they wrote them and revised them in a book. More than 700 years ago, at Dan no Ura, in the Straits of Shimonoseki, was fought the last battle of the long contest between the Heike, or Tiara clan, and the Genji, or Minamoto clan. There the Heike perished utterly, with their women and children, and their infant emperor likewise, now remembered as Antoku Tenno, and that sea and shore have been haunted for 700 years. Elsewhere I told you about the strange crabs found there, called Heike crabs, which have human faces on their backs, and are said to be the spirits of the Heike warriors. But there are many strange things to be seen and heard along that coast. On dark nights, thousands of ghostly fires hover about the beach or flit above the waves, pale lights which the fishermen call oni-bi, or demon fires. and whenever the winds are up, a sound of great shouting comes from that sea, like the clamor of battle. In former years, the Heike were much more restless than they now are. They would rise about ships passing in the night and try to sink them, and at all times they would watch for swimmers to pull them down. It was in order to appease these dead that the Buddhist temple, Amadaji, was built at Akamagaseki. A cemetery also was made close by, near the beach, and within it were set up monuments inscribed with the names of the drowned emperor and of his great vassals, and Buddhist services were regularly performed there on behalf of the spirits of them. After the temple had been built and the tombs erected, the Heike gave less trouble than before, but they continued to do queer things at intervals, proving they had not found the perfect peace. Some centuries ago there lived at Akamagaseki a blind man named Hoichi, who was famed for his skill in recitation and in playing upon the biwa. From childhood he had been trained to recite and to play, and while yet a lad he had surpassed his teachers. As a professional biwa hoshi, he became famous chiefly by his recitations of the history of the Heike and the Genji, and it is said that when he sang the song of the Battle of Dan no Nura, even goblins could not refrain from tears. At the outset of his career, Hoichi was very poor, but he found a good friend to help him. The priest of the Amadaji was fond of poetry and music, and he often invited Hoichi to the temple to play and recite. Afterwards, being much impressed by the wonderful skill of the lad, the priest proposed that Hoichi should make the temple his home, and this offer was gratefully accepted. Hoichi was given a room in the temple building, and, in return for food and lodging, he was required only to gratify the priest with a musical performance on certain evenings when otherwise disengaged. One summer night the priest was called away to perform a Buddhist service at the house of a dead parishioner, and he went there with his acolyte, leaving Hoichi alone in the temple. It was a hot night, and the blind man sought to cool himself on the veranda before his sleeping room. The veranda overlooked a small garden in the rear of the Amadaji. There Hoichi waited for the priest's return and tried to relieve his solitude by practicing upon his biwa. Midnight passed, and the priest did not appear. But the atmosphere was still too warm for comfort within doors, and Hoichi remained outside. At last he heard steps approaching from the back gate. Somebody crossed the garden, advanced to the veranda, and halted directly in front of him, but it was not the priest. A deep voice called the blind man's name abruptly and unceremoniously, in the manner of a samurai summoning an inferior.
Hoichi!
Hoichi was too much startled for the moment to respond, and the voice called again in a tone of harsh command.
Hoichi!
"Hi," answered the blind man, frightened by the menace in the voice. "I am blind. I cannot know who calls."
There is nothing to fear,
the stranger exclaimed, speaking more gently.
I am stopping near this temple, and I have been sent to you with a message. My present lord, a person of exceedingly high rank, is now staying in Akamagaseki with many noble attendants. He wished to view the scene of the battle of Dan no Ura, and today he visited that place. Having heard of your skill in reciting the story of the battle, he now desires to hear your performance, so you will take your biwa and come with me at once to the house where the august assembly is waiting.
In those times, the order of a samurai was not to be lightly disobeyed. Hoichi donned his sandals, took his biwa, and went away with the stranger, who guided him deftly but obliged him to walk very fast. The hand that guided was iron, and the clank of the warrior's stride proved him fully armed, probably some palace guard on duty. Hoichi's first alarm was over. He began to imagine himself in good luck, for, remembering the retainer's assurance about a person of exceedingly high rank, he thought that the lord who wished to hear the recitation could not be less than a daimyo of the first class. Presently the samurai halted, and Hoichi became aware that they had arrived at a large gateway, and he wondered, for he could not remember any large gate in that part of the town, except the main gate of the Amadaji.
Kaimon!
The samurai called, and there was a sound of unbarring, and the twain passed on. They traversed a space of garden, and halted again before some entrance, and the retainer cried in a loud voice, "Within there! I have brought Hoichi!" Then came sounds of feet hurrying, and screens sliding, and rain doors opening, and voices of women in converse. By the language of the women, Hoichi knew them to be domestics in some noble household, but he could not imagine to what place he had been conducted. Little time was allowed him for conjecture. After he had been helped to mount several stone steps, upon the last of which he was told to leave his sandals, a woman's hand guided him along interminable reaches of polished planking and round pillared angles too many to remember, and over widths amazing of matted floor into the middle of some vast apartment. There he thought that great many people were assembled. The sound of the rustling of silk was like the sound of leaves in a forest. He heard also a great humming of voices talking in undertones, and the speech was the speech of courts. Hoichi was told to put himself at ease, and he found a kneeling cushion ready for him. After having taken his place upon it, and tuned his instrument, the voice of a woman whom he divined to be the rojo, or matron in charge of the female service, addressed him, saying, "It is now required that the history of the Heike be recited to the accompaniment of the biwa." Now, the entire recital would have required a time of many nights, therefore Hoichi ventured a question. "As the whole of the story is not soon told, what portion is it augustly desired that I now recite?" The woman's voice made answer, "Recite the story of the battle at Dan no Ura, for the pity of it is the most deep." Then Hoichi lifted up his voice and chanted the chant of the fight on the bitter sea, wonderfully making his biwa to sound like the straining of oars and the rushing of ships, the whir and the hissing of arrows, the shouting and the trampling of men, the crashing of steel upon helmets, the plunging of the slain in the flood. And to the left and the right of him, in the pauses of his playing, he could hear voices murmuring praise. How marvelous an artist! Never in our own province was playing heard like this. Not in all the empire is there another singer like Hoichi. Then fresh courage came to him, and he played and sang yet better than before, and a hush of wonder deepened about him. But when at last he came to tell the fate of the fair and the helpless, the piteous perishing of the women and children, and the death leap of Nino Ama with the imperial infant in her arms, then all the listeners uttered together one long, long, shuddering cry of anguish, and thereafter they wept and wailed so loudly and so wildly that the blind man was frightened by the violence of the grief that he had made. For much time the sobbing and the wailing continued, but gradually the sounds of lamentation died away, and again, in the great stillness that followed, Hoichi heard the voice of the woman whom he supposed to be the rojo. She said, "Although we had been assured that you were a very skillful player upon the biwa, without an equal in recitative, we did not know that anyone could be so skillful as you have proved yourself tonight. Our Lord has been pleased to say that he intends to bestow upon you a fitting reward, but he desires that you shall perform before him once every night for the next 6 nights, after which time he will probably make his august return journey. Tomorrow night, therefore, you are to come here at the same hour. The retainer who tonight conducted you will be sent for you. There is another matter about which I have been ordered to inform you. It is required that you shall speak to no one of your visits here during the time of our Lord's august sojourn at Akamagaseki. As he is traveling incognito, he commands that no mention of these things be made. You are now free to go back to your temple." After Hoichi had duly expressed his thanks, a woman's hand conducted him to the entrance of the house, where the same retainer, who had before guided him, was waiting to take him home. The retainer led him to the veranda at the rear of the temple, and there bade him farewell. It was almost dawn when Hoichi returned, but his absence from the temple had not been observed, as the priest, coming back at a very late hour, had supposed him asleep. During the day, Hoichi was able to take some rest, and he said nothing about his strange adventure. In the middle of the following night, the samurai again came for him and led him to the august assembly, where he gave another recitation with the same success that had attended his previous performance. But, during this second visit, his absence from the temple was accidentally discovered, and after his return in the morning, he was summoned to the presence of the priest, who said to him, in a tone of kindly reproach, "We have been very anxious about you, friend Hoichi. To go out, blind and alone, at so late an hour is dangerous. Why did you go without telling us? I could have ordered a servant to accompany you. And where have you been?" Hoichi answered evasively, "Pardon me, kind friend. I had to attend to some private business, and I could not arrange the matter at any other hour." The priest was surprised rather than pained by Hoichi's reticence. He felt it to be unnatural and suspected something wrong. He feared that the blind lad had been bewitched or deluded by some evil spirits. He did not ask any more questions, but he privately instructed the men servants of the temple to keep watch upon Hoichi's movements and to follow him in case he should again leave the temple after dark. On the very next night, Hoichi was seen to leave the temple, and the servants immediately lighted their lanterns and followed after him. But it was a rainy night and very dark, and before the temple folks could get to the roadway, Hoichi had disappeared. Evidently he had walked very fast, a strange thing considering his blindness, for the road was in bad condition. The men hurried through the streets, making inquiries at every house which Hoichi was accustomed to visit, but nobody could give them any news of him. At last, as they were returning to the temple by way of the shore, they were startled by the sound of a biwa furiously playing in the cemetery of the Amadaji. Except for some ghostly fires, such as usually flitted there on dark nights, all was blackness in that direction. But the men at once hastened to the cemetery, and there, by the help of their lanterns, they discovered Hoichi, sitting alone in the rain before the memorial tomb of Antoku Tenno, making his biwa resound and loudly chanting the chant of the Battle of Dan no Ura. And behind him and about him and everywhere above the tombs, the fires of the dead were burning like candles. Never before had so great a host of Onubi appeared in the sight of mortal man. "Hoichi-san! Hoichi-san!" the servants cried. "You are bewitched! Hoichi-san!" But the blind man did not seem to hear. Strenuously he made his biwa to rattle and ring and clang. More and more wildly he chanted the chant of the Battle of Dan no Ura. They caught hold of him, they shouted into his ear, "Hoichi-san! Hoichi-san! Come home with us at once!" Reprovingly he spoke to them. "To interrupt me in such a manner before this august assembly will not be tolerated." Whereat, in spite of the weirdness of the thing, the servants could not help laughing. Sure that he had been bewitched, they now seized him and pulled him up on his feet, and by main force hurried him back to the temple, where he was immediately relieved of his wet clothes by order of the priest, and reclad and made to eat and drink. And then the priest insisted upon a full explanation of his friend's astonishing behavior. Hoichi long hesitated to speak, but at last, finding that his conduct had really alarmed and angered the good priest, he decided to abandon his reserve, and he related everything that had happened from the time of the first visit of the samurai. The priest said, "Hoichi, my poor friend, you are now in great danger. How unfortunate that you did not tell me all this before. Your wonderful skill in music has indeed brought you into strange trouble. By this time you must be aware that you have not been visiting any house whatever, but have been passing your nights in the cemetery among the tombs of the Heike, and it was before the memorial tomb of Antoku Tenno that your people tonight found you, sitting in the rain. All that you have been imagining was illusion, except the calling of the dead. By once obeying them, you have put yourself in their power. If you obey them again, after what has already occurred, they will tear you in pieces. But they would have destroyed you, sooner or later, in any event. Now, I shall not be able to remain with you tonight. I am called away to perform another service. But before I go, it will be necessary to protect your body by writing holy texts upon it." Before sundown, the priest and his acolyte stripped Hoichi. Then, with their writing brushes, they traced upon his breast and back, head and face and neck, limbs and hands and feet, even upon the soles of his feet and upon all the parts of his body, the text of the Holy Sutra called Hanya Shinkyo. When this had been done, the priest instructed Hoichi, saying, "Tonight, as soon as I go away, you must seat yourself on the veranda and wait. You will be called. But whatever may happen, do not answer and do not move. Say nothing and sit still as if meditating. If you stir or make any noise, you will be torn asunder. Do not get frightened and do not think of calling for help, because no help could save you. If you do exactly as I tell you, the danger will pass, and you will have nothing more to fear." After dark, the priest and the acolyte went away, and Hoichi seated himself on the veranda according to the instructions given him. He laid his biwa on the planking beside him and, assuming the attitude of meditation, remained quite still, taking care not to cough or to breathe audibly. For hours he stayed thus. Then, from the roadway, he heard the steps coming. They passed the gate, crossed the garden, approached the veranda, stopped directly in front of him.
"Hoichi!"
the deep voice called, but the blind man held his breath and sat motionless.
"Hoichi!"
grimly called the voice a second time, then a third time savagely,
"Hoichi!"
Hoichi remained still as a stone, and the voice grumbled,
"No answer. That won't do. Must see where the fellow is."
There was a noise of heavy feet mounting upon the veranda. The feet approached deliberately, halted beside him. Then for long minutes, during which Hoichi felt his whole body shake to the beating of his heart, there was dead silence. At last the gruff voice muttered close to him, "Here is the biwa, but of the biwa player I see only 2 ears. So that explains why he did not answer. He had no mouth to answer, with there is nothing left of him but his ears. Now to my lord, these ears I will take, in proof that the august commands have been obeyed, so far as was possible." In that instant, Hoichi felt his ears gripped by fingers of iron and torn off. Great as the pain was, he gave out no cry. The heavy footfalls receded along the veranda, descended into the garden, passed out into the roadway, ceased. From either side of his head, the blind man felt a thick, warm trickling, but he dared not lift his hands. Before sunrise, the priest came back. He hastened at once to the veranda in the rear, stepped and slipped upon something clammy, and uttered a cry of horror, for he saw by the light of his lantern that the clamminess was blood. But he perceived Hoichi sitting there in the attitude of meditation, with the blood still oozing from his wounds. "My poor Hoichi!" cried the startled priest. "What is this? You have been hurt?" At the sound of his friend's voice, the blind man felt safe. He burst out sobbing and tearfully told his adventure of the night. "Poor, poor Hoichi," the priest exclaimed. "All my fault, my very grievous fault. Everywhere upon your body the holy texts had been written, except your ears. I trusted my acolyte to do that part of the work, and it was very, very wrong of me not to have made sure that he had done it. Well, now the matter cannot be helped. We can only try to heal your hurts as soon as possible. Cheer up, my friend. The danger is now well over. You will never again be troubled by these visitors." With the aid of a good doctor, Hoichi soon recovered from his injuries. The story of his strange adventure spread far and wide, and soon made him famous. Many noble persons went to Agamakaseki to hear him recite, and large presents of money were made to him so that he became a wealthy man. But from the time of his adventure, he was known only by the appellation of Mimi-Nashi-Hoichi, Hoichi the Earless. At Taiyan, there lived a man named Wang. One morning he was out walking when he met a young lady carrying a bundle and hurrying along by herself. As she moved along with some difficulty, impeded, of course, by her bound feet, this practice is said to have originated about A.D. 970 with Yao Niang, the concubine of the pretender Li Yu, who wished to make her feet like the new moon. The Manchu or Tartar ladies never adopted this custom, and therefore the empresses of modern times have had feet of the natural size. Neither is it in force among the Hakkas or among the hill tribes of China and Formosa and others. The practice was forbidden in 1664 by the Manchu Emperor Qiangxi, but popular feeling was so strong on the subject that 4 years afterwards the prohibition was withdrawn. A vigorous attempt is now being made to secure natural feet for the Chinese girl, with more chance of success. As she moved along with some difficulty, Wang quickened his pace and caught her up, and found she was a pretty girl of about 16. Much smitten, he inquired whither she was going so early, and no one with her. "A traveler like you," replied the girl, "cannot alleviate my distress. Why trouble yourself to ask?" "What distress is it?" said Wang. "I'm sure I'll do anything I can for you." "My parents," answered she, "loved money, and they sold me as a concubine into a rich family where the wife was very jealous and beat and abused me morning and night. It was more than I could stand, so I have run away." Wang asked her where she was going, to which she replied that a runaway had no fixed place of abode. "My house," said Wang, "is at no great distance. What do you say to coming there?" She joyfully acquiesced, and Wang, taking up her bundle, led the way to his house. Finding no one there, she asked Wang where his family were, to which he replied that this was only the library. "And a very nice place, too," said she. "But if you are kind enough to wish to save my life, you mustn't let it be known that I am here." Wang promised he would not divulge her secret, and so she remained there for some days without anyone knowing anything about it. He then told his wife, and she, fearing the girl might belong to some influential family, advised him to send her away. This, however, he would not consent to do. when one day, going into the town, he met a Taoist priest who looked at him in astonishment and asked him what he had met. "I have met nothing," replied Wang. "Why," said the priest, "you are bewitched. What do you mean by not having met anything?" But Wang insisted that it was so, and the priest walked away, saying, "The fool! Some people don't seem to know when death is at hand." This startled Wang, who at first thought of the girl, but then he reflected that a pretty young thing as she was couldn't well be a witch, and began to suspect that the priest merely wanted to do a stroke of business. When he returned, the library door was shut, and he couldn't get in, which made him suspect that something was wrong, and so he climbed over the wall, where he found the door of the inner room shut too. Softly creeping up, he looked through the window and saw a hideous devil with a green face and jagged teeth like a saw, spreading a human skin upon the bed and painting it with a paintbrush. The devil then threw aside the brush and, giving the skin a shake-out just as you would a coat, threw it over its shoulders when, lo, it was the girl. Terrified at this, Wang hurried away with his head down in search of the priest, who had gone he knew not whither, subsequently finding him in the fields, where he threw himself on his knees and begged the priest to save him. "As to driving her away," said the priest, "the creature must be in great distress to be seeking a substitute for herself. Besides, I could hardly endure to injure a living thing." The disembodied spirits of the Chinese inferno are permitted, under certain conditions of time and good conduct, to appropriate to themselves the vitality of some human being, who, as it were, exchanges places with the so-called devil. The devil does not, however, reappear as the mortal whose life it has become possessed of, but is merely born again into the world. The idea being that the amount of life on earth is a constant quantity and cannot be increased or diminished, reminding one, in a way, of the great modern doctrine of the conservation of energy. This curious belief has an important bearing that will be brought out in a subsequent story. Here again is a Taoist priest quoting the Buddhist commandment, "Thou shalt not take life." The Buddhist laity in China, who do not hesitate to take life for the purposes of food, salve their consciences from time to time by buying birds, fishes, etc., and letting them go, in the hope that such acts will be set down on the credit side of their record of good and evil. "As to driving her away," said the priest, "the creature must be in great distress to be seeking a substitute for herself. Besides, I could hardly endure to injure a living thing." However, he gave Wang a fly brush and bade him hang it at the door of the bedroom, agreeing to meet again at the Qing-Ti temple. Wang went home, but did not dare enter the library, so he hung up the brush at the bedroom door, and before long heard a sound of footsteps outside. Not daring to move, he made his wife peep out, and she saw the girl standing looking at the brush, afraid to pass it. She then ground her teeth and went away, but in a little while came back and began cursing, saying, "You priest, you won't frighten me. Do you think I am going to give up what is already in my grasp?" Thereupon she tore the brush to pieces and, bursting open the door, walked straight up to the bed, where she ripped open Wang and tore out his heart, with which she went away. Wang's wife screamed out, and the servant came in with a light, but Wang was already dead and presented a most miserable spectacle. His wife, who was in an agony of fright, hardly dared cry for fear of making a noise, and the next day she sent Wang's brother to see the priest. The latter got into a great rage and cried out, "Was it for this that I had compassion on you, devil that you are?" Proceeding at once with Wang's brother to the house, from which the girl had disappeared without anyone knowing whither she had gone. But the priest, raising his head, looked all around and said, "Luckily, she's not far off." He then asked who lived in the apartments on the south side, to which Wang's brother replied that he did, whereupon the priest declared that there she would be found. Wang's brother was horribly frightened and said he didn't think so, and then the priest asked him if any stranger had been to the house. To this he answered that he had been out to the Qing-Ti temple and couldn't possibly say, but he went off to inquire, and in a little while came back and reported that an old woman had sought service with them as a maid of all work and had been engaged by his wife. "That is she," said the priest, as Wang's brother added she was still there, and they all set out to go to the house together. Then the priest took his wooden sword and, standing in the middle of the courtyard, shouted out, "Base-born fiend, give me back my fly brush!" Meanwhile, the new maid-of-all-work was in a great state of alarm and tried to get away by the door, but the priest struck her down and she fell flat, the human skin dropped off, and she became a hideous devil. There she lay, grunting like a pig, until the priest grasped his wooden sword and struck off her head. She then became a dense column of smoke curling up from the ground when the priest took an uncorked gourd and threw it right into the midst of the smoke. A sucking noise was heard, and the whole column was drawn into the gourd, after which the priest corked it up closely and put it in his pouch. The skin, too, which was complete even to the eyebrows, eyes, hands, and feet, he also rolled up as if it had been a scroll, and was on the point of leaving with it, when Wang's wife stopped him and with tears entreated him to bring her husband to life. The priest said he was unable to do that, but Wang's wife flung herself at his feet and with loud lamentations implored his assistance. For some time he remained immersed in thought, and then replied, "My power is not equal to what you ask. I myself cannot raise the dead, but I will direct you to someone who can, and if you apply to him properly, you will succeed." Wang's wife asked the priest who it was, to which he replied, "There is a maniac in the town who passes his time groveling in the dirt. Go, prostrate yourself before him, and beg him to help you. If he insults you, show no sign of anger." Wang's brother knew the man to whom he alluded, and accordingly bade the priest adieu and proceeded thither with his sister-in-law. They found the destitute creature raving away by the roadside, so filthy that it was all they could do to go near him. Wang's wife approached him on her knees, at which the maniac leered at her and cried out, "Do you love me, my beauty?" Wang's wife told him what she had come for, but he only laughed and said, "You can get plenty of other husbands. Why raise the dead one to life?" But Wang's wife entreated him to help her, whereupon he observed, "It is very strange. People apply to me to raise their dead as if I was the king of the infernal regions." He then gave Wang's wife a thrashing with his staff, which she bore without a murmur and before a gradually increasing crowd of spectators. After this, he produced a loathsome pill which he told her she must swallow, but here she broke down and was quite unable to do so. However, she did manage it at last, and then the maniac, crying out, "How you do love me!" got up and went away without taking any more notice of her. They followed him into a temple with loud supplications, but he had disappeared, and every effort to find him was unsuccessful. Overcome with rage and shame, Wang's wife went home, where she mourned bitterly over her dead husband, grievously repenting the steps she had taken and wishing only to die. She then bethought herself of preparing the corpse, near which none of the servants would venture, and set to work to close up the frightful wound of which he died. While thus employed, interrupted from time to time by her sobs, she felt a rising lump in her throat, which by and by came out with a pop and fell straight into the dead man's wound. Looking closely at it, she saw it was a human heart, and then it began, as it were, to throb, emitting a warm vapor like smoke. Much excited, she at once closed the flesh over it and held the sides of the wound together with all her might. Very soon, however, she got tired, and finding the vapor escaping from the crevices, she tore up a piece of silk and bound it round, at the same time bringing back circulation by rubbing the body and covering it up with clothes. In the night she removed the coverings and found that breath was coming from the nose, and by the next morning her husband was alive again, though disturbed in mind as if awaking from a dream and feeling a pain in his heart. Where he had been wounded, there was a cicatrix about as big as a cash, which soon after disappeared. Is my soul tamed and baby-rid with the thought that flood or field can render back to scare men and the moon the airy shapes of the corses they enwomb? And what if 'tis so? Shall I lose the crown of my most golden hope, 'cause its fair circle is haunted by a shadow? From the coast of Cumberland, the beautiful old castle of Carlaverock is seen standing on a point of a fine green promontory, bounded by the river Nith on one side, by the deep sea on the other, by the almost impassable morass of the Solway on the third, while, far beyond, you observe the three spires of Dumfries and the high green hills of Dalswinton and Keir. It was formerly the residence of the almost princely names of Douglas, Seaton, Kirkpatrick, and Maxwell. It is now the dwelling place of the hawk and the owl. Its courts are a lair for cattle, and its walls afford a midnight shelter to the passing smuggler, or, like those of the city doomed in Scripture, are places for the fishermen to dry their nets. Between this fine old ruin and the banks of the Nith, at the foot of a grove of pines, and within a stone cast of the tide mark, there remains a rude cottage, yet visible to the curious eye. The bramble and the wild plum have in vain tried to triumph over the huge grey granite blocks which compose the foundation of its walls. The vestiges of a small garden may still be traced, more particularly in summer, when roses and lilies and other relics of its former beauty begin to open their bloom, clinging, amid the neglect and desolation of the place, with something like human affection to the soil. This rustic ruin presents no attractions to the eye of the profound antiquary compared to those of its more stately companion, Carlaverock Castle. But with this rude cottage and its garden, tradition connects a tale so wild and so moving as to elevate it, in the contemplation of the peasantry, above all the princely feasts and feudal atrocities of its neighbour. It is now some 50 years since I visited the parish of Carlaverock, but the memory of its people, its scenery, and the story of the ghost with the golden casket are as fresh with me as matters of yesterday. I had walked out to the river bank one sweet afternoon of July, when the fishermen were hastening to dip their nets in the coming tide, and the broad waters of the Solway Sea were swelling and leaping against bank and cliff as far as the eye could reach. It was studded over with boats, and its more unfrequented bays were white with waterfowl. I sat down on a small grassy mound between the cottage ruins and the old garden plot, and gazed, with all the hitherto untasted pleasure of a stranger, on the beautiful scene before me. On the right, and beyond the river, the mouldering relics of the ancient religion of Scotland ascended in unassimilating beauty above the humble kirk of New Abbey and its squalid village. Further to the south rose the white, sharp cliffs of Barnhoorie, while on the left stood the ancient keeps of Cumlogan and Torthorald and the castle of Carlaverock. Over the whole looked the stately green mountain of Criffel, confronting its more stately but less beautiful neighbour, Skiddaw, while between them flowed the deep, wide sea of Solway, hemmed with cliff and castle and town. As I sat, looking on the increasing multitudes of waters and watching the success of the fishermen, I became aware of the approach of an old man, leading, as one will conduct a dog on a string, a fine young milk cow on a halter of twisted hair, which, passing through the ends of 2 pieces of flat wood fitted to the animal's cheekbones, pressed her nose and gave her great pain whenever she became disobedient. The cow seemed willing to indulge the luxury of a browse on the rich pasture which surrounded the little ruined cottage, but in this humble wish she was not to be indulged, for the aged owner, coiling up the tether and seizing her closely by the head, conducted her past the tempting herbage toward a small and close-cropped hillock a good stone-cast distant. In this piece of self-denial the animal seemed reluctant to sympathize. She snuffed the fresh green pasture and plunged and startled and nearly broke away. What the old man's strength seemed nearly unequal to was accomplished by speech. bonny lady," said he in a soothing tone. "It canna be, it maunna be, hinny. What would become of my 3 bonny grandbairns, made fatherless and mitherless by that false flood afore us, if they supped milk and tasted butter that came from the green sward of this doomed and unblessed spot?" The animal appeared to comprehend something in her own way from the speech of her owner. She abated her resistance, and, indulging only in a passing glance at the rich, deep herbage, passed on to her destined pasture. I had often heard of the singular superstitions of the Scottish peasantry, and that every hillock had its song, every hill its ballad, and every valley its tale. I followed with my eye the old man and his cow. He went but a little way, till, seating himself on the ground, retaining still the tether in his hand, he said, "Now, bonny lady, feast thy fill on this good greensward. It is halesome and holy compared to the sword of the doomed cottage of old Gibbie Grape. Leave that to smugglers' nags. Willie o' Brandyburn and Rolling Lock o' Kempstain will call the haunted hall his hind bit. They are godless fear-nots." I looked at the person of the peasant. He was a stout, hale old man with a weather-beaten face, furrowed something by time and, perhaps, by sorrow. Though summer was at its warmest, he wore a broad, checkered mantle fastened at the bosom with a skewer of steel. A broad bonnet, from beneath the circumference of which straggled a few thin locks as white as driven snow, shining like amber and softer than the finest flax, while his legs were warmly cased in blue-ribbed boot-hose. Having laid his charge to the grass, he looked leisurely around him, and, espying me, a stranger, and dressed above the manner of the peasantry, he acknowledged my presence by touching his bonnet, and, as if willing to communicate something of importance, he struck the tether stake in the ground and came to the old garden fence. Wishing to know the peasant's reasons for avoiding the ruins, I thus addressed him. "This is a pretty spot, my aged friend, and the herbage looks so fresh and abundant that I would advise thee to bring thy charge hither, and, while she continued to browse, I would gladly listen to the history of thy white locks, for they seem to have been bleached in many tempests." "Aye, aye," said the peasant, shaking his white head with a grave smile. "They have braved sundry tempests between 16 and 60, but, touching this pasture, sir, I know nobody who would like their cows to crop it. The aged cattle shun the place, the bushes bloom but bear no fruit, the birds never build in the branches, the children never come near to play, and the aged never choose it for a resting place, but, pointing it out as they pass to the young, tell them the story of its desolation. So you see, sir, having nae good will to such a spot of earth myself, I like little to see a stranger sitting in such an unblessed place, and would good as advise ye to come over with me to the cowslip knoll. There are reasons many that an honest man should nae sit there." I arose at once, and, seating myself beside the peasant on the cowslip knoll, desired to know something of the history of the spot from which he had just warned me. The Caledonian looked on me with an air of embarrassment. "I am just thinking," said he, "that as ye are an Englishman, I should nigh acquaint you with such a story. You'll make it, I'm doubting, a matter of reproach and vaunt when ye gae home, how Willie Borland of Carlaverock told you a tale of Scottish iniquity that cowed all the stories in Southern book or history." The unexpected obstacle was soon removed. "My sage and considerate friend," I said, "I have the blood in my bosom will keep me from revealing such a tale to the scoffer and the scorner. I am something of a Carlaverock man, the grandson of Marion Stoby of Dukedub." The peasant seized my hand. "Marion Stoby! Bonny Marion Stoby of Dukedub, whom I wooed sae sair and loved sae long. Man, I love you for her sake, and well was it for her brow English bridegroom that William Borland, frail and faded now, but strong and in manhood then, was 1,000 miles from Carlaverock, rolling in the salt sea when she was brided. You have the glance of her ee. I could ken it among 10,000, grey as my head is. I will tell the grandson of Bonny Marion Stoby ony tale he likes to ask for, and the story of the ghost in the Golden Casket shall be foremost." "You may imagine, then," said the old Carlaverock peasant, rising at once with the commencement of his story from his native dialect into very passable English. "You may imagine these ruined walls raised again in their beauty, whitened and covered with a coating of green broom, that garden now desolate, filled with herbs in their season, and with flowers, hemmed round with a fence of cherry and plum trees, and the whole possessed by a young fisherman, who won a fair subsistence for his wife and children from the waters of the Solway Sea. You may imagine it, too, as far from the present time as 50 years. There are only 2 persons living now who remember when the Bon Homme Richard, the first ship ever Richard Falder commanded, was wrecked on the Pellic Sand. One of those persons now addresses you, and the other is the fisherman who once owned that cottage, whose name ought never to be named, and whose life seems lengthened as a warning to the earth how fierce God's judgments are. Life changes. All breathing things have their time and their season, but the Solway flows in the same beauty, Criffel rises in the same majesty, the light of the morning comes, and the full moon arises now as they did then. But this moralizing matters little. It was about the middle of harvest. I remember the day well. It had been sultry and suffocating, accompanied by rushings of wind, sudden convulsions of the water, and cloudings of the sun. I heard my father sigh and say, "Dole, dole to them found on the deep sea tonight. There will happen strong storm and fearful tempest." The day closed, and the moon came over Skiddaw. All was perfectly clear and still. Frequent dashings and whirling agitations of the sea were soon heard, mingling with the hasty clang of the waterfowl's wings as they forsook the waves and sought shelter among the hollows of the rocks. The storm was nigh. The sky darkened down at once. Clap after clap of thunder followed, and lightning flashed so vividly and so frequent that the wide and agitated expanse of Solway was visible from side to side, from St. Bees to Barnhuri. A very heavy rain mingled with hail succeeded, and a wind accompanied it, so fierce and so high that the white foam of the sea was showered as thick as snow on the summit of Carlaverock Castle. Through the perilous sea, and amid this darkness and tempest, a bark was observed coming swiftly down the middle of the seas, her sails rent and her decks crowded with people. The carry, as it is called, of the Tempest was direct from St. Bees to Carlaverock, and experienced swains could see that the bark would soon be driven full on the fatal shoals at the Scottish side. But the lightning was so fierce that few dared to venture to look on the approaching vessel, or take measures for endeavoring to preserve the lives of the unfortunate mariners. My father stood on the threshold of his door and beheld all that passed in the bosom of the sea. The bark approached fast, her canvases rent to threads, her masts nearly leveled with the deck, and the sea foaming over her so deep and so strong as to threaten to sweep the remains of her crew from the little refuge the broken masts and splintered beams still afforded them. She now seemed within a half-mile of the shore, when a strong flash of lightning that appeared to hang over the bark for a moment showed the figure of a lady, richly dressed, clinging to a youth who was pressing her to his bosom. My father exclaimed, "Saddle me my black horse, and saddle me my grey, and bring them down to the dead man's bank." And, swift in action as he was in resolve, he hastened to the shore, his servants following with his horses. The shore of Solway presented then, as it does now, the same varying line of coast, and the house of my father stood in the bosom of a little bay nearly a mile from where we sit. The remains of an old forest interposed between the bay at Dead Man's Bank and the bay at our feet, and mariners had learned to wish that if it were their doom to be wrecked, it might be in the bay of Douce William Borland rather than that of Gilbert Grape, the proprietor of that ruined cottage. But human wishes are vanities, wished either by sea or by land. I have heard my father say he could never forget the cries of the mariners as the bark smote on the Pellic bank and the flood rushed through the chasms made by the concussions, but he would far less forget the agony of a lady, the loveliest that could be looked upon, and the calm and affectionate courage of the young man who supported her and endeavored to save her from destruction. Richard Falder, the only man who survived, has often sat at my fireside and sung me a very rude but very moving ballad which he made on this young and unhappy pair, and the old mariner assured me that he had only added rhymes and a descriptive line or two to the language in which Sir William Musgrave endeavored to soothe and support his wife. It seemed a thing truly singular that at this very moment 2 young fishermen, who sat on the margin of the sea below us, watching their have-nets, should sing, and with much sweetness, the very song the old man had described. They warbled verse and verse alternately, and rock and bay seemed to retain and then release the sound. Nothing is so sweet as a song by the seaside on a tranquil evening. Sir William Musgrave, First Fisherman, O lady, lady, why do you weep? Though the wind be loosed on the raging deep, though the heaven be murker than murk may be, and our frail bark ships a fearful sea, yet thou art safe as on that sweet night when our bridal candles gleamed fair and bright. There came a shriek, and there came a sound, and the Solway roared, and the ship spun round. Second Fisherman. O lady, lady, why do you cry? Though the waves be flashing topmast high, though our frail bark yields to the dashing brine, and heaven and earth show no saving sign, there is one who comes in the time of need, and curbs the waves as we curb a steed. The lightning came with the whirlwind blast, and cleaved the prow, and smote down the mast. First Fisherman. O lady, lady, weep not nor wail, though the sea runs how as Dalswinton vale, then flashes high as Barnhuri brave, and yawns for thee like the yearning grave. Though twixt thee and the ravening flood there is but my arm and this splintering wood, the fell quicksand or the famished brine can ne'er harm a face as fair as thine. Both. O lady, lady, be bold and brave, spread thy white breast to the fearful wave, and cling to me with that white right hand, I'll set thee safe on good dry land. A lightning flash on the shallop strook, the Solway roared, and Carlaverock shook, from the sinking ship there were shriekings cast, that were heard above the tempest's blast. The young fishermen having concluded their song, my companion proceeded. The lightning still flashed vivid and fast, and the storm raged with unabated fury, for between the ship and the shore the sea broke in frightful undulation, and leapt on the greensward several fathoms deep abreast. My father, mounted on one horse, and holding another in his hand, stood prepared to give all the aid that a brave man could to the unhappy mariners, but neither horse nor man could endure the onset of that tremendous surge. The bark bore for a time the fury of the element, but a strong eastern wind came suddenly upon her, and, crushing her between the wave and the freestone bank, drove her from the entrance of my father's little bay toward the dwelling of Gibbie Grape, and the thick forest intervening, she was out of sight in a moment. My father saw for the last time the lady and her husband looking shoreward from the side of the vessel as she drifted along, and as he galloped around the head of the forest, he heard for the last time the outcry of some and the wail and intercession of others. When he came before the fisherman's house, a fearful sight presented itself. The ship, dashed to atoms, covered the shore with its wreck and with the bodies of mariners. Not a living soul escaped, save Richard Falder, whom the fiend who guides the spectre shallop of Solway had rendered proof to perils on the deep. The fisherman himself came suddenly from his cottage, all dripping and drenched, and my father addressed him, "Oh, Gilbert, Gilbert, what a fearful sight is this! Has heaven blessed thee with making thee the means of saving a human soul?" "Nor soul nor body have I saved," said the fisherman doggedly. "I have done my best. The storm proved too stark, and the lightning too fierce for me. Their boat alone came near with a lady and a casket of gold, but she was swallowed up with the surge." My father confessed afterward that he was touched with the tone in which these words were delivered, and made answer, "If thou hast done thy best to save souls tonight, a bright reward will be thine. If thou hast been fonder for gain than for working the mariner's redemption, thou hast much to answer for." As he uttered these words, an immense wave rolled landward as far as the place where they stood. It almost left its foam on their faces, and, suddenly receding, deposited at their feet the dead body of the lady. As my father lifted her in his arms, he observed that the jewels which had adorned her hair, at that time worn long, had been forcibly rent away. The diamonds and gold that encircled her neck and ornamented the bosom of her rich satin dress had been torn off, the rings removed from her fingers, and on her neck, lately so lily-white and pure, there appeared to be the marks of hands, not laid there in love and gentleness, but with a fierce and deadly grasp. The lady was buried with the body of her husband, side by side, in Carlaverock burial ground. My father never openly accused Gilbert the fisherman of having murdered the lady for her riches as she reached the shore, preserved, as was supposed, from sinking by her long, wide, and stiff satin robes. But from that hour till the hour of his death, my father never broke bread with him, never shook him or his by the hand, nor spoke with them, in wrath or in love. The fisherman from that time, too, waxed rich and prosperous, and, from being the needy proprietor of a have-net and the tenant at will of a rude cottage, he became, by purchase, lord of a handsome inheritance, proceeded to build a bonny mansion, and called it Grape Ha, and became a leading man in a flock of a pure kind of Presbyterians, and a precept and example to the community. Though the portioner of Grape Ha prospered wondrously, his claims to parochial distinction and the continuance of his fortune were treated with scorn by many, and with doubt by all. Though nothing open or direct was said, looks, more cutting at times than the keenest speech, and actions still more expressive, showed that the hearts of honest men were alienated. The cause was left to his own interpretation. The peasant scrupled to become his servant. Sailors hesitated to receive his grain on board, lest peril should find them on the deep. The beggar ceased to solicit alms. The drover and horse-crouper, an unscrupling generation, found out a more distant mode of concluding bargains than by shaking his hand. His daughters, handsome and blue-eyed, were neither wooed nor married. No maiden would hold tryst with his sons, though maidens were then as little loth as they are now, and the aged peasant, as he passed his new mansion, would shake his head and say, "The voice of spilt blood will be lifted up against thee, and a spirit shall come from the waters, will make the cornerstone of thy habitation tremble and quake." It happened during the summer which succeeded this unfortunate shipwreck that I accompanied my father to the Solway to examine his nets. It was near midnight. The tide was making, and I sat down by his side and watched the comings of the waters. The shore was glittering in starlight as far as the eye could reach. Gilbert, the fisherman, had that morning removed from his cottage to his new mansion. The former was, therefore, untenanted, and the latter, from its vantage ground on the crest of the hill, threw down to us the sound of mirth and music and dancing, a revelry common in Scotland on taking possession of a new house. As we lay quietly looking on the swelling sea and observing the waterfall swimming and ducking in the increasing waters, the sound of the merriment became more audible. My father listened to the mirth, looked to the sea, looked to the deserted cottage, and then to the new mansion, and said, "My son, I have a counsel to give thee. Treasure it in thy heart, and practice it in thy life. The daughters of him of Grape Ha are fair, and have an eye that would while away the wits of the wisest. Their father has wealth. I say naught of the way he came by it. They will have golden portions, doubtless. But I would rather lay thy head aneath the gowns on Carlaverock kirkyard, and son have I none beside thee, than see thee lay it on the bridal pillow with the begotten of that man, though she had Nithsdale for her dowry. Let not my words be as seed sown on the ocean. I may not now tell thee why this warning is given. Before that fatal shipwreck, I would have said that Prudence Grape in her castle was a better bride than some who have golden dowers. I have long thought that someone would see a sight, and often, while holding my have-net in the moonlight tide, I have looked for something to appear. For, where blood is shed, there doth the spirit haunt for a time, and give warning to man. May I be strengthened to endure the sight." I answered not, being accustomed to regard my father's counsel as a matter not to be debated, as a solemn command. We heard something like the rustling of wings on the water, accompanied by a slight curling motion of the tide. "God bowed his right hand about us," said my father, breathing thick with emotion and awe, and looking out on the sea with a gaze so intense that his eyes seemed to dilate and the hair of his forehead to project forward and bristle into life. I looked, but observing nothing save a long line of thin and quavering light dancing along the surface of the sea. It ascended the bank on which it seemed to linger for a moment, and then, entering the fisherman's cottage, made roof and rafter gleam with sudden illumination. "I'll tell thee what, Gibby Grape," said my father. I would now be the owner of thy heart and the proprietor of thy right hand for all the treasures of earth and ocean." A loud and piercing scream from the cottage made us thrill with fear, and in a moment the figures of 3 human beings rushed into the open air and ran toward us with a swiftness which supernatural dread alone could inspire. We instantly knew them to be 3 noted smugglers who infested the country, and, rallying when they found my father maintain his ground, they thus mingled their fears and the secrets of their trade, for terror fairly overpowered their habitual caution. "I vow by the night tide and the crooked timber," said Willie Wheathouse, "I never beheld sic a light as yon since our distillation pipe took fire, and made a burnt instead of a drink offering of our spirits. I'll uphold it comes for Nygoat, a warning may be. Say ye may go on, Willie Bouthouse way, with your wickedness. As for me, I's go home and repent." "Soulless body," said his companion, whose natural hardihood was considerably supported by his communion with the brandy cup. "Soulless body for a flaff of fire and a maiden shadda, would ye forswear the gallant trade? Sound to good. But old Miller Morrison shall turn your thrapple into a drain pipe to wise the wastewater from his mill if ye turn back now and help us nigh through with the strongest importation as ever cheered the throat and cheaped in the crapin'. Confound the fizzonless body. He glowers as if this fine starlight were something for the worst side of the world, and these staring e'en of his busy shaping heaven's sweetest and balmiest air into the figures of wraiths and goblins." "Robert Telfer," said my father, addressing the 3rd smuggler, "tell me not of your secrets of your perilous craft, but tell me what you have seen and why you uttered that fearful scream that made the wood doves start from Carlaverock pines." "I'll tell you what, good man," said the mariner. "I have seen the fires of heaven running as thick along the sky and on the surface of the ocean as you ever saw the blaze on a bowl or a punch at merrymaking, and neither quaked nor screamed. But you'll mind the light that came into that cottage tonight was one for some fearful purport, which, let the wise expound, say it lessened nigh one's courage to quail for sic an apparition. Odd! If I'd thought living soul would ever make the start I'd gied an upcast to me, I'd drill his breastbane with my dirk like some turnip lantern." My father mollified the wrath of this maritime desperado by assuring him that he beheld the light go from the sea to the cottage, and that he shook with terror, for it seemed no common light. "Ha! Good then," said hopeful Robin. "Since it was one of our ain Kenny's sea apparitions, I careless about it. I took it for some landward sprite, and now I think on it, where were my een? Did it no stand among its ain light, with its long hanks of hair dripping and drenched, with a casket of gold in ae hand and the other guarding its throat? I'll be bound it's the ghost of some sonsy lass that has had her neck nipped for her gold, and had she stayed till I emptied the bicker of brandy, I would have asked a canny question or tway." Willie Wheathouse had now fairly overcome his consternation, and began to feel all his love for the gallant trade, as his comrade called it, return. "The tide serves, lads, the tide serves. Let us slip our drape of brandy in the bit bonny boat and toddle away among the sweet starlight as far as the Kingholm or the town curry. You ken we have to meet the Ballygardavine and Lady Sir Carsey of Ladomouth." They returned, not without hesitation and fear, to the old cottage, carried their brandy to the boat, and, as my father and I went home, we heard the dipping of their oars in the Nith, along the banks of which they sold their liquor and told their tale of fear, magnifying its horror at every step and introducing abundance of variations. The story of the ghost with the golden casket flew over the countryside with all its variations and with many comments. Some said they saw her, and some thought they saw her, and those who had the hardihood to keep watch on the beach at midnight had their tales to tell of terrible lights and strange visions. With one who delighted in the marvellous, the spectre was decked with attributes that made the circle of auditors tighten round the hearth, while others, who allowed the ghost only a certain quantity of thin air to clothe itself in, reduced it in their description to a very unpoetic shadow, or a kind of better sort of will-o'-the-wisp that could for its own amusement counterfeit the human shape. There were many who, like my father, beheld the singular illumination appear at midnight on the coast, saw also something sailing along with it in the form of a lady in bright garments, her hair long and wet and shining in diamonds, and heard a struggle and the shriek as of a creature drowning. The belief of the peasantry did not long confine the apparition to the sea coast. It was seen sometimes late at night far inland and following Gilbert the fisherman like a human shadow, like a pure light, like a white garment, and often in the shape and with the attributes which had disturbed the carousel of smugglers. I heard Douce Davy Haining, a God-fearing man and an elder of the burgher congregation, and on whose word I could well lippen when drink was kept from his head, I heard him say that as he rode home late from the rude fair of Dumfries, the night was dark, there lay a dusting of snow on the ground, and no one appeared on the road but himself. He was lilting and singing the canny end of the old song, "There's a cutty stool in our kirk," which was made on some foolish queen's misfortune, when he heard the sound of horses' feet behind him at full gallop, and ere he could look around, who should flee past, urging his horse with whip and spur, but Gilbert the fisherman. "Little wonder that he galloped," said the elder, "for a fearful form hovered round him, making many a clutch at him, and with every clutch uttering a shriek most piercing to hear." But why should I make a long story of a common tale? The curse of spilt blood fell on him and on his children and all he possessed. His sons and daughters died, his flocks perished, his grain grew but never filled the ear, and fire came from heaven or rose from hell and consumed his house and all that was therein. He is now a man of 90 years, a fugitive and a vagabond on the earth, without a house to put his white head in, with the unexpiated curse still clinging to him. While my companion was making this summary of human wretchedness, I observed the figure of a man stooping to the earth with extreme age, gliding through among the bushes of the ruined cottage and approaching the advancing tide. He wore a loose great coat, patched to the ground and fastened around his waist by a belt and buckle. The remains of stockings and shoes were on his feet. A kind of fisherman's cap surmounted some remaining white hairs, and a long peeled stick supported him as he went. My companion gave an involuntary shudder when he saw him. "Lo and behold, now here comes Gilbert the fisherman. Once every 24 hours doth he come, let the wind and rain be as they will, to the nightly tide, to work o'er again in imagination his old tragedy of unrighteousness. See how he waves his hand as if he welcomed someone from sea. He raises his voice too, as if something in the water required his counsel, and see how he dashes up the middle and grapples with the water as if he clutched a human being." I looked on the old man and heard him call in a hollow and broken voice, "Oh, hoy, the ship! Oh, hoy, turn your boat's head ashore, and my bonny lady, keep bowed o' your casket. Hecht, be it that wave would have sunk a 3-decker, let be a slender boat. See, and she been a-sailing aboon the water like a wild swan." And, wading deeper in the tide as he spoke, he seemed to clutch at something with both hands and struggle with it in the water. Na, dinna hand your white hands to me. You wear oud mickle gowd in your hair, and many diamonds on your bosom to scape drowning. There's as mickle gowd in this casket as would have sunk thee 70 fathom deep." And as he continued to hold his hands under the water, muttering all the while, "She's half gone now, and I'll be a brow laird and build a bonny house and gang crousely to kirk and market. Now I may let the waves work their will, my work will be taken for theirs." He turned to wade to the shore, but a large and heavy wave came full dash on him and bore him off his feet, and ere any assistance reached him, all human aid was too late. For nature was so exhausted with the fullness of years and with his exertions that a spoonful of water would have drowned him. The body of this miserable old man was interred, after some opposition from the peasantry, beneath the wall of the kirkyard, and from that time the ghost with the golden casket was seen no more, and only continued to haunt the evening tale of the hind and the farmer. Long, long ago, a farmer named Lenine lived in Basine.
He had but one son, Frank Lenine, who was indulged into waywardness by both his parents. In addition to the farm servants, there was one, a young girl, Nancy Trenoweth, who especially assisted Mrs. Lenine in all the various duties of a small farmhouse. Nancy Trenoweth was very pretty, and although perfectly uneducated in the sense in which we now employ the term education, she possessed many native graces, and she had acquired much knowledge really useful to one whose aspirations would probably never rise higher than to be mistress of a farm of a few acres. Educated by parents who had certainly never seen the world beyond Penzance, her ideas of the world were limited to the few miles around the land's end. But although her book of nature was a small one, it had deeply impressed her mind with its influences. The wild waste, the small but fertile valley, the rugged hills with their crowns of cairns, the moors rich in the golden furze and purple heath, the sea-beaten cliffs and the silver sands were the pages she had studied under the guidance of a mother who conceived, in the sublimity of her ignorance, that everything in nature was the home of some spirit form. The soul of the girl was imbued with the deeply religious dye of her mother's mind, whose religion was only a sense of an unknown world immediately beyond our own. The elder Nancy Trenoweth exerted over the villagers around her considerable power. They did not exactly fear her. She was too free from evil for that. But they were conscious of a mental superiority and yielded without complaining to her sway. The result of this was that the younger Nancy, although compelled to service, always exhibited some pride from a feeling that her mother was a superior woman to any around her. She never felt herself inferior to her master or mistress, and yet she complained not of being in subjection to them. There were so many interesting features in the character of this young servant girl that she became in many respects like a daughter to her mistress. There was no broad line of division in those days, even in the manorial hall, between the lord and his domestics, and still less defined was the position of the employer and the employed in a small farmhouse. Consequent to this condition of things, Frank Lenine and Nancy were thrown as much together as if they had been brother and sister. Frank was rarely checked in anything by his over-fond parents, who were especially proud of their son, since he was regarded as the handsomest young man in the parish. Frank conceived a very warm attachment for Nancy, and she was not a little proud of her lover. Although it was evident to all in the parish that Frank and Nancy were seriously devoted to each other, the young man's parents were blind to it, and were taken by surprise when one day Frank asked his father and mother to consent to his marrying Nancy. The Lenines had allowed their son to have his own way from his youth up, and now, in a matter which brought into play the strongest of human feelings, they were angry because he refused to bend to their wills. The old man felt it would be a degradation for a Lenine to marry a Trenoweth, and, in the most unreasoning manner, he resolved it should never be. The first act was to send Nancy home to Alcea Mill, where her parents resided. The next was an imperious command to his son never again to see the girl. The commands of the old are generally powerless upon the young where the affairs of the heart are concerned. So were they upon Frank. He who was rarely seen of an evening beyond the garden of his father's cottage was now as constantly absent from his home. The house, which was wont to be a pleasant one, was strangely altered. A gloom had fallen over all things. The father and the son rarely met as friends. The mother and her boy now had a feeling of reserve. Often there were angry altercations between the father and son, and the mother felt she could not become the defender of her boy in his open acts of disobedience, his bold defiance of his parents' commands. Rarely an evening passed that did not find Nancy and Frank together in some retired nook. The Holy Well was a favorite meeting place, and here the most solemn vows were made. Locks of hair were exchanged. A wedding ring, taken from the finger of a corpse, was broken when they vowed that they would be united either dead or alive, and they even climbed at night the granite pile at Tryrin and swore by the Loggenrock the same strong vow. Time passed onward thus unhappily, and as the result of the endeavors to quench out the passion by force, it grew stronger under the repressing power and, like imprisoned steam, eventually burst through all restraint. Nancy's parents discovered at length that moonlight meetings between two untrained, impulsive youths had a natural result, and they were now doubly earnest in their endeavors to compel Frank to marry their daughter. The elder Lenine could not be brought to consent to this, and he firmly resolved to remove his son entirely from what he considered the hateful influences of the Trenoweths. He resolved to go to Plymouth, to take his son with him, and, if possible, to send him away to sea, hoping thus to wean him from his folly, as he considered this love madness. Frank, poor fellow, with the best intentions, was not capable of any sustained effort, and consequently he at length succumbed to his father, and, to escape his persecution, he entered a ship bound for India, and bade adieu to his native land. Frank could not write, and this happened in days when letters could be forwarded only with extreme difficulty. Consequently, Nancy never heard from her lover. A babe had been born into a troublesome world, and the infant became a real solace to the young mother. As the child grew, it became an especial favorite with its grandmother. The elder Nancy rejoiced over the little prattler and forgot her cause of sorrow. Young Nancy lived for her child and on the memory of its father. Subdued in spirit she was, but her affliction had given force to her character, and she had been heard to declare that wherever Frank might be, she was ever present with him. Whatever might be the temptations of the hour, that her influence was all-powerful over him for good. She felt that no distance could separate their souls, that no time could be long enough to destroy the bond between them. A period of distress fell upon the Trenoweths, and it was necessary that Nancy should leave her home once more and go again into service. Her mother took charge of the babe, and she found a situation in the village of Kimyal in the parish of Paul. Nancy, like her mother, contrived by force of character to maintain an ascendancy amongst her companions. She had formed an acquaintance, which certainly never grew into friendship, with some of the daughters of the small farmers around. These girls were all full of the superstitions of the time and place. The winter was coming on, and nearly 3 years had passed away since Frank Lenine left his country. As yet there was no sign. Nor father, nor mother, nor maiden had heard of him, and they all sorrowed over his absence. The Lenines desired to have Nancy's child, but the Trenoweths would not part with it. They went so far even as to endeavor to persuade Nancy to live again with them, but Nancy was not at all disposed to submit to their wishes. It was All Hallows' Eve, and 2 of Nancy's companions persuaded her, no very difficult task, to go with them and sow hemp seed. At midnight, the 3 maidens stole out unperceived into Kimyal town place to perform the incantation. Nancy was the first to sow, the others being less bold than she. Boldly she advanced, saying, as she scattered the seed, "Hemp seed I sow thee, hemp seed I grow thee, and he who will my true love be, come after me and show thee." This was repeated 3 times, when, looking back over her left shoulder, she saw Lenine. But he looked so angry that she shrieked with fear and broke the spell. One of the other girls, however, resolved now to make a trial of the spell, and the result of her labors was the vision of a white coffin. Fear now fell on all, and they went home sorrowful, to spend, each one, a sleepless night. November came with its storms, and during one terrific night a large vessel was thrown upon the rocks in Barrow Hill Cliff, and, beaten by the impetuous waves, she was soon in pieces. Amongst the bodies of the crew washed ashore, nearly all of whom had perished, was Frank Lenine. He was not dead when found, but the only words he lived to speak were begging the people to send for Nancy Trenoweth, that he might make her his wife before he died. Rapidly sinking, Frank was borne by his friends on a litter to Basine, but he died as he reached the town place. His parents, overwhelmed in their own sorrows, thought nothing of Nancy, and, without her knowing that Lenine had returned, the poor fellow was laid in his last bed in Burien churchyard. On the night of the funeral, Nancy went, as was her custom, to lock the door of the house, and, as was her custom too, she looked out onto the night. At this instant, a horseman rode up in hot haste, called her by name, and hailed her in a voice that made her blood boil. The voice was the voice of Lenine. She could never forget that, and the horse she now sought was her sweetheart's favorite colt, on which he had often ridden at night to Alcia. The rider was imperfectly seen, but he looked very sorrowful and deathly pale. Still, Nancy knew him to be Frank Lenine. He told her that he had just arrived home, and that the first moment he was at liberty he had taken to fetch his loved one and to make her his bride. Nancy's excitement was so great that she was easily persuaded to spring on the horse behind him that they might reach his home before the morning. When she took Lenine's hand, a cold shiver passed through her, and as she grasped his waist to secure herself in her seat, her arm became as stiff as ice. She lost all power of speech and suffered deep fear, yet she knew not why. The moon had arisen and now burst out in a full flood of light through the heavy clouds which had obscured it. The horse pursued its journey with great rapidity, and whenever in weariness it slackened its speed, the peculiar voice of the rider aroused its drooping energies. Beyond this, no word was spoken since Nancy had mounted behind her lover. They now came to Trove Bottom, where there was no bridge at that time. They dashed into the river. The moon shone full in their faces. Nancy looked into the stream and saw that the rider was in a shroud and other grave clothes. She now knew she was being carried away by a spirit, and yet she had no power to save herself. Indeed, the inclination to do so did not exist. On went the horse at a furious pace until they came to the blacksmith shop near Bury in Churchtown, when she knew by the light from the forge fire thrown across the road that the smith was still at his labors. She now recovered speech. "Save me! Save me! Save me!" she cried with all her might. The smith sprang from the door of the smithy with a red-hot iron in his hand, and, as the horse rushed by, caught the woman's dress and pulled her to the ground. The spirit, however, also seized Nancy's dress in one hand, and his grasp was like that of a vice. The horse passed like the wind, and Nancy and the smith were pulled down as far as the old almshouses near the churchyard. Here the horse for a moment stopped. The smith seized that moment and, with his hot iron, burned off the dress from the rider's hand, thus saving Nancy, more dead than alive, while the rider passed over the wall of the churchyard and vanished on the grave into which Lenine had been laid but a few hours before. The smith took Nancy into his shop, and he soon aroused some of his neighbors, who took the poor girl back to Alcia. Her parents laid her on her bed. She spoke no word but to ask for her child, to request her mother to give up the child to Lenine's parents, and her desire to be buried in his grave. Before the morning light fell on the world, Nancy had breathed her last breath. A horse was seen that night to pass through the church town like a ball from a musket, and in the morning Lenine's colt was found dead in Burnowhall Cliff, covered with foam, its eyes forced from its head, and its swollen tongue hanging out of its mouth. On Lenine's grave was found the piece of Nancy's dress, which was left in the spirit's hand when the smith burnt her from his grasp. It is said that one or two of the sailors who survived the wreck related after the funeral how, on the 30th of October, at night, Lenine was like one mad. They could scarcely keep him in the ship. He seemed more asleep than awake, and, after great excitement, he fell as if dead upon the deck and lay so for hours. When he came to himself, he told them that he had been taken to the village of Kemyal, and if he ever married the woman who had cast the spell, he would make her suffer the longest day she had to live for drawing his soul out of his body. Poor Nancy was buried in Lenine's grave, and her companion in a sewing hemp seed, who saw the white coffin, slept beside her within the year.
Spring was once more in the world. As she sang to herself in the faraway woodlands, her voice reached even the ears of the city, weary with the long winter. Daffodils flowered at the entrances to the subway, furniture-removing vans blocked the side streets, Children clustered like blossoms on the doorsteps, the open cars were running, and the cry of the cash-clo man was once more heard in the land. Yes, it was the spring, and the city dreamed wistfully of lilacs and the dewy piping of birds in gnarled old apple trees, of dogwood lighting up with sudden silver the thickening woods, of water plants unfolding their glossy scrolls in pools of morning freshness. On Sunday mornings, the outbound trains were thronged with eager pilgrims hastening out of the city to behold once more the ancient marvel of the spring. And, on Sunday evenings, the railway termini were aflower with banners of blossom from rifled woodland and orchard, carried in the hands of the returning pilgrims, whose eyes still shone with the spring magic, in whose ears still sang the fairy music. And as I beheld these signs of the vernal equinox, I knew that I, too, must follow the music, forsake awhile the beautiful siren we call the city, and, in the green silences, meet once more my sweetheart, Solitude. As the train drew out of the Grand Central, I hummed to myself, "I've a neater, sweeter maiden in a greener, cleaner land." And so I said goodbye to the city and went forth with beating heart to meet the spring. I had been told of an almost forgotten corner on the south coast of Connecticut where the spring and I could live in inviolate loneliness, a place uninhabited save by birds and blossoms, woods and thick grass, and an occasional silent farmer, and pervaded by the breath and shimmer of the sound. Nor had rumor lied, for when the train set me down at my destination, I stepped out into the most wonderful green hush, a leafy Sabbath silence through which the very train, as it went further on its way, seemed to steal as noiselessly as possible for fear of breaking the spell. After a winter in the town, to be dropped thus suddenly into the intense quiet of the countryside makes an almost ghostly impression upon one, as of an enchanted silence, a silence that listens and watches but never speaks, finger on lip. There is a spectral quality about everything upon which the eye falls. The woods, like great green clouds, the wayside flowers, the still farmhouses half lost in orchard bloom, all seem to exist in a dream. Everything is so still, everything so supernaturally green. Nothing moves or talks except the gentle susurrus of the spring wind swaying the young buds high up in the quiet sky, or a bird now and again, or a little brook singing softly to itself among the crowding rushes. Though, from the houses one notes here and there are evidently human inhabitants of this green silence, none are to be seen. I have often wondered where the country folk hide themselves, as I have walked hour after hour past farm and croft and lonely dooryards and never caught sight of a human face. If you should want to ask the way, a farmer is as shy as a squirrel, and if you knock at a farmhouse door, all as silent as a rabbit warren. As I walked along in the enchanted stillness, I came at length to a quaint old farmhouse, old colonial in its architecture, embowered in white lilacs and surrounded by an orchard of ancient apple trees which cast a rich shade on the deep spring grass. The orchard had the impressiveness of those old religious groves, dedicated to the strange worship of sylvan gods, gods to be found now only in Horace or Catullus, and the hearts of young poets to whom the beautiful antique Latin is still dear. The old house seemed already the abode of solitude. As I lifted the latch of the white gate and walked across the forgotten grass and up onto the veranda already festooned with wisteria and looked in the window, I saw Solitude sitting by an old piano on which no composer later than Bach had ever been played. In other words, the house was empty, and going round to the back, where old barns and stables leaned together as if falling asleep, I found a broken pane and so climbed in and walked through the echoing rooms. The house was very lonely. Evidently no one had lived in it for a long time. Yet it was all ready for some occupant for whom it seemed to be waiting. Quaint old four-poster bedsteads stood in 3 rooms, dimity curtains and spotless linen, old oak chests and mahogany presses, and, opening doors in Chippendale sideboards, I came upon beautiful, frail old silver and exquisite china that set me thinking of a beautiful grandmother of mine, made out of old lace and laughing wrinkles and mischievous old blue eyes. There was one little room that particularly interested me, a tiny bedroom, all white, and at the window the red roses were already in bud. But what caught my eye with peculiar sympathy was a small bookcase in which were some 20 or 30 volumes, wearing the same forgotten expression, forgotten and yet cared for, which lay like a kind of memorial charm upon everything in the old house. Yes, everything seemed forgotten, and yet everything, curiously, even religiously, remembered. I took out book after book from the shelves. Once or twice flowers fell out from the pages, and I caught sight of a delicate handwriting here and there, and frail markings. It was evidently the little intimate library of a young girl. What surprised me most was to find that quite half the books were in French poets and French romancers, a charming, very rare edition of Ronsard, a beautifully printed edition of Alfred de Musset, and a copy of Théophile Gautier's Mademoiselle de Maupin. How did these exotic books come to be there alone in a deserted New England farmhouse? This question was to be answered later in a strange way. Meanwhile, I had fallen in love with the sad, old, silent place, and as I closed the white gate and was once more on the road, I looked about for someone who could tell me whether or not this house of ghosts might be rented for the summer by a comparatively living man. I was referred to a fine old New England farmhouse shining white through the trees a quarter of a mile away. There I met an ancient couple, a typical New England farmer and his wife. The old man, lean, chin-bearded, with keen gray eyes flickering occasionally with a shrewd humor. The old lady with a kindly old face of a withered apple type and ruddy. They were evidently prosperous people, but their minds, for some reason I could not at the moment divine, seemed to be divided between their New England desire to drive a hard bargain and their disinclination to let the house at all. Over and over again they spoke of the loneliness of the place. They feared I would find it very lonely. No one had lived in it for a long time, and so on. It seemed to me that afterwards I understood their curious hesitation, but at the moment only regarded it as a part of the circuitous New England method of bargaining. At all events, the rent I offered finally overcame their disinclination, whatever its cause, and so I came into possession, for 4 months, of that silent old house with the white lilacs and the drowsy barns and the old piano and the strange orchard. And, as the summer came on and the year changed its name from May to June, I used to lie under the apple trees in the afternoons, dreamily reading some old book, and through half-sleepy eyelids watching the silken shimmer of the Sound. I had lived in the old house for about a month, when one afternoon a strange thing happened to me. I remember the date well. It was the afternoon of Tuesday, June 13th. I was reading, or rather dipping here and there, in Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy. As I read, I remember that a little unripe apple, with a petal or two of blossom still clinging to it, fell upon the old yellow page. Then I suppose I must have fallen into a dream, though it seemed to me that both my eyes and my ears were wide open, for I suddenly became aware of a beautiful young voice singing very softly somewhere among the leaves. The singing was very frail, almost imperceptible, as though it came out of the air. It came and went fitfully, like the elusive fragrance of sweetbriar, as though a girl was walking to and fro, dreamily humming to herself in the still afternoon. Yet there was no one to be seen. The orchard had never seemed more lonely. And another fact that struck me as strange was that the words that floated to me out of the aerial music were French, half sad, half gay snatches of some long-dead singer of old France. I looked about for the origins of the sweet French sounds, but in vain. Could it be that the birds were singing in French in this strange orchard? Presently the voice seemed to come quite close to me, so near that it might have been the voice of a dryad singing to me out of the tree against which I was leaning. And this time I distinctly caught the words of the sad little song. Chantez, Rossignol, chantez, toi qui as le coeur gai, tu as le coeur à rire, moi je l'étais pleurer. But though the voice was at my shoulder, I could see no one. And then the singing stopped with what sounded like a sob, and a moment or two later I seemed to hear a sound of sobbing far down the orchard. Then there followed silence, and I was left to ponder the strange occurrence. Naturally, I decided it was just a daydream between sleeping and waking over the pages of an old book. Yet, when next day and the day after the invisible singer was in the orchard again, I could not be satisfied with such mere matter-of-fact explanation. "À la claire fontaine," went the voice to and fro through the thick orchard boughs. "Mais allant promener, je trouve l'eau si belle, que je me suis baigné. Lui oui au longtemps que je t'aime, jamais je n'ai t'oublié." It was certainly uncanny to hear that voice going to and fro in the orchard, there somewhere amid the bright, sun-dazzled boughs, yet not a human creature to be seen, not another house even within half a mile. The most materialistic mind could hardly but conclude that here was something not dreamed of in our philosophy. It seemed to me that the only reasonable explanation was the entirely irrational one, that my orchard was haunted by some beautiful young spirit with some sorrow of lost joy that would not let her sleep quietly in her grave. And next day I had a curious confirmation of my theory. Once more I was lying under my favorite apple tree, half reading and half watching the sound, lulled into a dream by the whir of insects and the spices called up from the earth by the hot sun. As I bent over the page, I suddenly had the startling impression that someone was leaning over my shoulder and reading with me, and that a girl's long hair was falling over me down onto the page. The book was the Ronsard I had found in the little bedroom. I turned, but again there was nothing there. Yet this time I knew that I had not been dreaming, and I cried out, "Poor child, tell me of your grief, that I may help your sorrowing heart to rest." But of course there was no answer. Yet that night I dreamed a strange dream. I thought I was in the orchard again in the afternoon, and once again heard the strange singing, but this time, as I looked up, the singer was no longer invisible. Coming toward me was a young girl with wonderful blue eyes filled with tears and gold hair that fell to her waist. She wore a straight white robe that might have been a shroud or a bridal dress. She appeared not to see me, though she came directly to the tree where I was sitting, and there she knelt and buried her face in the grass and sobbed as if her heart would break. Her long hair fell over her like a mantle, and in my dream I stroked it pityingly and murmured words of comfort for a sorrow I did not understand. Then I woke suddenly, as one does from dreams. The moon was shining brightly into the room. Rising from my bed, I looked out into the orchard. It was almost bright as day. I could plainly see the tree of which I had been dreaming, and then a fantastic notion possessed me. Slipping on my clothes, I went out into one of the old barns and found a spade. Then I went to the tree where I had seen the girl weeping in my dream and dug down at its foot. I had dug little more than a foot when my spade struck upon some hard substance, and in a few more moments I had uncovered and exhumed a small box, which, on examination, proved to be one of those pretty, old-fashioned Chippendale work boxes used by our grandmothers to keep their thimbles and needles in, their reels of cotton and skeins of silk. After smoothing down the little grave in which I had found it, I carried the box into the house and under the lamplight examined its contents. Then at once I understood why that sad young spirit went to and fro the orchard singing those little French songs, for the treasure trove I had found under the apple tree, the buried treasure of an unquiet, suffering soul, proved to be a number of love letters written mostly in French in a very picturesque hand. Letters, too, written but some 5 or 6 years before. Perhaps I should not have read them, yet I read them with such reverence for the beautiful, impassioned love that animated them, and literally made them smell sweet and blossom in the dust, that I felt I had the sanction of the dead to make myself the confidant of their story. Among the letters were little songs, 2 of which I had heard the strange young voice singing in the orchard, and, of course, there were many withered flowers and such like remembrances of bygone rapture. Not that night could I make out all the story, though it was not difficult to define its essential tragedy. And later on, a gossip in the neighborhood and a headstone in the churchyard told me the rest. The unquiet young soul that had sung so wistfully to and fro in the orchard was my landlord's daughter. She was the only child of her parents, a beautiful, willful girl, exotically unlike those from whom she was sprung and among whom she lived with the disdainful air of exile. She was, as a child, a little creature of fairy fancies, and as she grew up it was plain to her father and mother that she had come from another world than theirs. To them she seemed like a child in an old fairy tale strangely found on his hearth by some shepherd as he returns from the fields at evening, a little fairy girl swaddled in fine linen and dowered with a mysterious bag of gold. Soon she developed delicate spiritual needs to which her simple parents were strangers. From long truancies in the woods she would come home laden with mysterious flowers, and soon she came to ask for books and pictures and music of which the poor souls that had given her birth had never heard. Finally she had her way and went to study at a certain fashionable college, and there the brief romance of her life began. There she met a romantic young Frenchman who had read Ronsard to her and had written the picturesque letters I had found in the old mahogany work-box. And after a while the young Frenchman had gone back to France, and the letters had ceased. Month by month went by, and at length one day, as she sat wistful at the window, looking out at the foolish sunlit road, a message came. He was dead. The headstone in the village churchyard tells the rest. She was very young to die, scarcely 19 years, and the dead who have died young, with all their hopes and dreams still like unfolded buds within their hearts, do not rest so quietly in the grave as those who have gone through the long day from morning until evening and are only too glad to sleep. Next day I took the little box to a quiet corner of the orchard and made a little pyre of fragrant boughs, for so I interpreted the wish of the young unquiet spirit. And the beautiful words are now safe, taken up again into the aerial spaces from which they came. But since then, the birds sing no more little French songs in my old orchard. You are listening to Restored Lore, where I find the best weird old stories and bring them to you every week. If you like the odd and the obscure, subscribe, click the notification bell, and give me a like or a comment. Thank you. See you next week.